Welcome to Quiet Chronicles. Adam Smith is one of those names people use before they have met the man behind it. He is summoned in arguments about capitalism, free markets, greed, government, wages, trade, poverty, empire, and the price of almost everything. Politicians quote him. Economists claim him. Critics blame him. Admirers turn him into a prophet of modern commerce. Yet the real Adam Smith was not a loud champion of business, and he did not begin with markets at all. He began with morals, sympathy, judgment, friendship, books, classrooms, and a small Scottish town looking out toward the sea. Before we begin, if you enjoy long-form historical stories told in this calmer style, a like and subscription helps Quiet Chronicles continue publishing every week. And let us know in the comments where you are listening from tonight. It is always remarkable to see how far one story can travel. If there is a person, topic, story, or era you would like covered next, leave that below as well. For now, the trail begins far from modern stock exchanges and financial screens, in 18th century Scotland, with a fatherless child, a watchful mother, and a coastal town called Kirkcaldy. Chapter 1. A child of Kirkcaldy. Adam Smith was born in Kirkcaldy, a small town on the coast of Fife, in June of 1723. Across the water lay the Firth of Forth, with Edinburgh beyond it, and along the shore moved the ordinary traffic of an 18th century Scottish port: boats, cargo, customs men, local merchants, sailors, fishermen, and the slow commerce of a country still adjusting to its place inside a new British state. Smith entered that world without ever knowing his father. Adam Smith Sr., a lawyer and customs official, had died months before the child was born, leaving his widow, Margaret Douglas, to raise their son inside a household marked from the beginning by absence and careful order. Kirkcaldy was not a grand birthplace for a thinker who would later be attached to the language of global markets. It was a working town, close enough to trade to understand the habits of goods and duties, but far from the imperial offices where policy was written. Coal, salt, linen, grain, and small coastal cargoes belonged to its practical world. Ships did not make the town rich in any spectacular way, but they made movement visible. Things arrived, things left. Prices mattered. Work depended on weather, credit, rules, and the trustworthiness of people who might never meet again once a bargain had been made. Margaret Douglas gave Smith the first stable centre of his life. She came from a landowning family of some standing, and her position helped keep the household secure after her husband's death. Later accounts remembered Smith as deeply attached to her, and the long span of that attachment is one of the quieter facts of his biography. He would live with her again as an adult, return to her household during the years when he was writing his greatest book, and remain bound to her until her death late in his own life. Before Smith became a lecturer, author, traveller, or commissioner of customs, he was a son whose domestic world was shaped by a widowed mother's steadiness. The town around him belonged to a Scotland still carrying the consequences of union with England in 1707. The old Scottish Parliament was gone, but Scottish law, the Church of Scotland, local government, universities, and social habits remained distinct. For a bright child in Fife, this mattered because Scotland's institutions offered pathways that were narrower than those of England in wealth, yet often more open in education. Families that could not command great estates might still hope to place a capable son into learning, ministry, law, teaching, or administration. Smith's world was not democratic in the modern sense, but it did contain ladders, and books were among the rungs. His early education began at the Burgh School of Kirkcaldy, where Latin formed the foundation of serious learning. The curriculum was old in its bones. Boys worked through grammar, translation, classical authors, memory, and repetition, acquiring the habits that allowed educated men to speak across Europe through shared references. For Smith, this training mattered beyond its immediate lessons. His later prose, even when discussing trade or wages, carried the patience of someone trained to think through moral examples, ancient history, legal categories, and the long comparison of one society with another. One small story from Smith's childhood has followed him for centuries, though it must be handled with care. Early biographers reported that, when he was still very young, he was briefly carried off by a band of traveling people and then recovered by relatives. The tale has often been repeated because it has the shape of folklore, the future philosopher nearly disappearing before history can claim him. Its details are uncertain, and the telling probably grew softer or sharper as it passed from memory into biography. Still, the fact that it survived says something about how Smith was remembered by those who wanted his life to contain, even at the start, a narrow escape. The safer truth is less dramatic and more useful. Smith was a delicate child, often described as absent-minded, physically awkward, and unusually inward. Later observers noticed habits of abstraction in him, the tendency to fall into thought so completely that the world around him seemed to recede. Such traits are easy to exaggerate after fame has arrived. A famous thinker's childhood is often rewritten as prophecy. Yet in Smith's case, the accounts do fit the adult figure, a man who could move through ordinary society with kindness and good humor, while also belonging inwardly to the slow machinery of his own reflection. Kirkcaldy gave that inwardness a practical border. This was not the childhood of a cloistered aristocrat. The town contained tradesmen, shopkeepers, sailors, church elders, schoolmasters, officials, and families whose fortunes rose or fell through ordinary pressures. A customs officer's household would have known that trade was never just exchange. It was paperwork, inspection, duty, evasion, permission, and dispute. The later Adam Smith would criticize many restrictions on commerce, but he was never unaware that markets lived inside law. In that sense, one of the earliest facts around him was a simple administrative one. Goods moved because rules allowed them to move, and because people found ways around rules when they could. The Scotland of Smith's childhood was also a country of religious seriousness. The parish church was not merely a place of worship, it was part of the structure by which reputation, discipline, poor relief, moral conduct, and community belonging were watched. A child growing up in such a world learned early that human beings did not live as isolated appetites. They lived under the eyes of neighbors. Praise and blame had weight. Shame could be public. Sympathy, judgment, propriety, and self-command were not abstractions floating above daily life. They were woven into the manners of a town that knew who attended church, who paid debts, who kept promises, and who failed to behave as expected. That background matters because Smith's first great book would not be about money. It would be about moral sentiments, about the strange human ability to enter imaginatively into the feelings of others, and about the inward judge people carry because they have learned to see themselves as others might see them. Long before he wrote about the division of labor or the wealth of nations, Smith was trying to understand how people become moral beings in society. Kirkcaldy did not hand him that theory fully formed, but it gave him a living field of observation, a small community in which conduct was never private in any absolute way. The intellectual life of Scotland was beginning to change around him. Edinburgh was growing into a centre of law, medicine, publishing, clubs, argument, and improvement. Glasgow was becoming a university town of unusual force. Across the country, ministers, professors, lawyers, physicians, and landowners were asking how societies became more polished, more prosperous, more orderly, and more free. The word improvement carried a broad meaning in 18th-century Scotland. It could refer to agriculture, roads, manners, education, law, commerce, or the mind itself. Smith would grow into that word until much of his life became an inquiry into what improvement cost, what it created, and who benefited from it. At the level of family, however, the path remained modest and personal. Margaret Douglas had to turn a fatherless boy into a young scholar. That meant schooling, discipline, social introduction, and the preservation of opportunity. Smith's intelligence must have become visible early, because by the age of 14 he was sent to the University of Glasgow. 14 was not unusually young for university entrance in Scotland at the time, though it seems startling now. A boy who had mastered enough Latin and shown enough promise could move onward while still very much a child by later standards. The distance from Kirkcaldy to Glasgow was not only geographic, it was a passage from local formation into one of the most active intellectual institutions in Europe. The departure would have carried him away from the coast that had held his earliest years. Kirkcaldy remained behind as mother, memory, and origin, not as something discarded. Smith would return to it more than once, and in the long middle of his life it would again become the place where thought gathered itself into pages. For now, it had done its first work. It had given him a name inherited from a dead father, a mother whose presence endured, a schoolroom of Latin discipline, a town where trade and regulation were visible, and a moral community in which reputation mattered. When Adam Smith left for Glasgow, he did not leave as the father of anything. He was a scholarship boy from Fife, quiet, bookish, and still almost unknown outside the narrow circle that had noticed his promise. The theories later attached to him had not yet taken shape. The phrase that would make him famous in arguments he never heard had not yet been written. Ahead of him lay lecture halls, philosophical disputes, friendships, disappointments, and the first great teacher who would show him that moral philosophy could be a living inquiry into human society itself. Chapter 2. The Making of a Scottish Mind. Glasgow received Adam Smith as a young student in 1737, when he was about 14 years old and still closer to boyhood than to the public life that would later gather around his name. The university was not large by modern standards, but it stood at the centre of a Scottish educational world that valued argument, discipline, and the practical uses of learning. Its classrooms were attached to a city growing through commerce, tobacco connections, river trade, printing, and the ambitions of families who believed that education could move a son into law, ministry, medicine, teaching, or public office. Smith arrived from Kirkcaldy with Latin, promise, and the habits of a bright child whose mind had already begun to turn inward. Scottish universities differed from the older English model in ways that mattered for Smith's formation. They admitted students younger, drew from a wider social range, and treated philosophy as a subject with public consequences. A student did not enter simply to polish manners or inherit status. He entered a structured course of lectures, disputations, readings, and examinations, often under professors whose fees depended partly on attracting pupils. That system made teaching more immediate. Professors had to hold attention, and students encountered ideas not as ornaments of rank, but as tools for a life that still had to be made. Francis Hutcheson was the decisive figure in this early Glasgow world. He had come to the university with a reputation already formed by writings on beauty, virtue, moral sense, and human sociability, and his lecture room offered Smith something more alive than inherited scholastic formula. Hutcheson treated moral philosophy as a study of human beings in society, their affections, judgments, duties, rights, and forms of happiness. He also lectured in English rather than confining himself to Latin, a choice that had intellectual meaning as well as practical effect. It brought philosophy nearer to ordinary moral speech, where conduct, praise, blame, affection, and obligation could be examined in the language of living thought. In Hutcheson's classroom, Smith encountered a way of thinking that would never quite leave him. Human beings, in this vision, were not merely selfish creatures restrained by law or fear. They were responsive beings, capable of approval, fellow feeling, resentment, admiration, shame, and concern for how they appeared before others. Hutcheson's moral sense theory was not Smith's final doctrine, and Smith would later build something more intricate and restrained. Still, the older professor helped establish the problem that would occupy Smith before wealth did: how a social creature learns to judge itself and others without needing a policeman at every door. Glasgow's intellectual life also placed Smith near a city being changed by trade. The River Clyde had not yet reached the later scale of industrial Glasgow, but commercial ambition already pressed against the older town. Merchants, professors, clergy, lawyers, and civic officers shared overlapping circles. Students could hear moral philosophy in the lecture hall, and then step into streets where business, status, and public improvement were becoming visible parts of urban life. This mattered because Smith's mind did not form in a sealed philosophical chamber. He learned among institutions that made the connection between ideas and ordinary arrangements difficult to ignore. The curriculum gave him more than moral theory. Logic trained habits of order and distinction. Natural philosophy opened the world of matter, motion, astronomy, and experiment. Moral philosophy carried ethics into law, politics, and social obligation. Classical reading tied modern questions to ancient examples, and the Scottish habit of comparison made Greece, Rome, commercial Europe, and contemporary Britain part of the same broad inquiry. Smith's later writing would move with unusual ease across ages and societies because his education had trained him to treat history as a storehouse of evidence about human conduct. A scholarship then carried him south to Balliol College, Oxford, in 1740. The Snell Exhibition had been established to send promising Scottish students to Oxford, partly with an eye toward preparing them for service in the Anglican Church, though Smith would not follow that path. For a young Scot formed by Glasgow's active teaching culture, Oxford offered prestige, libraries, and distance from home, but it did not offer the same intellectual heat. Smith later wrote with severity about English universities, especially where professors had secure incomes regardless of whether they taught well. His criticism was not merely personal irritation. It became part of his lifelong interest in how incentives shaped institutions. Oxford's slower atmosphere did not mean the years were empty. Smith read heavily, and the libraries gave him access to a range of books no provincial student could easily command. He encountered ancient literature, modern philosophy, law, history, and the wider republic of letters through print. If Glasgow had shown him the force of teaching, Oxford showed him the strange independence of private study. A student neglected by instruction might still educate himself through books, though the cost was solitude and a kind of intellectual self-reliance that could sharpen judgment while narrowing companionship. His time at Oxford also exposed him to the religious and political differences between Scotland and England. A Presbyterian Scot living within an Anglican university could feel the weight of institutional belonging from the outside. The universities of England were tied to church, privilege, and old corporate forms in ways that Scottish institutions were not. Smith absorbed these differences quietly, but later, when he analysed corporations, monopolies, and protected offices, he did so with an eye trained by experience. Institutions could preserve learning, but they could also reward idleness when income was detached from service. A smaller incident from these years has often been repeated because it reveals the intellectual climate Smith inhabited. He was said to have been reprimanded at Oxford for reading David Hume's Treatise of Human Nature, a work viewed with suspicion because of Hume's religious skepticism and philosophical boldness. Whether the story is exact in every detail matters less than the world it discloses. Hume's thought already carried danger in polite institutions, and Smith's interest in him placed the young student near one of the most unsettling minds in Britain. In time, Hume would become Smith's closest intellectual friend, but before friendship came the attraction of a book that respectable authorities did not fully trust. Hume's importance to Smith cannot be reduced to influence in a simple line. Smith did not become Hume's disciple. He shared with him a taste for careful analysis, secular explanation, historical comparison, and suspicion toward easy moral certainty. Hume's essays and histories would later stand beside Smith's works as part of the Scottish Enlightenment's great achievement, a way of thinking about society without treating it as either a divine machine or a collection of isolated wills. Human beings formed habits, institutions, beliefs, markets, and laws over time, often producing results no single mind had designed. The years of study also taught Smith patience with complexity. A mind that would later write about prices, wages, division of labor, sympathy, justice, and state policy needed more than cleverness. It needed categories broad enough to hold human variety. Glasgow gave him a living teacher and a civic setting. Oxford gave him books, irritation, and independence. Between the two, Smith learned to distrust both intellectual laziness and institutional complacency. He had seen education work well enough to transform a young student from Fife, and poorly enough to make him ask why some offices rewarded men whether they fulfilled their duties or not. When he left Oxford in 1746, Smith did not return immediately as a famous scholar. He was educated, promising, and still searching for a path. The usual roads were not simple. He did not take orders in the Anglican Church, and the academic posts that would eventually shape his career were not yet his. Scotland offered possibilities, but they depended on reputation, recommendation, public performance, and the confidence of men already established in law, letters, and university life. The young scholar had to be seen as well as read. That need brought Smith back toward the lecture culture of Scotland. Edinburgh, with its lawyers, literati, clubs, publishers, physicians, and ambitious students, offered a public stage for serious thought. Before Smith became a professor at Glasgow, he would begin to make his name through lectures delivered outside the formal security of a university chair. This was a different kind of test from childhood schooling or university study. He would have to turn private reading into public argument and public argument into reputation. By then, the shape of his mind had begun to show. He had the moral seriousness of Hutcheson without Hutcheson's exact system, the historical curiosity that Scotland cultivated so well, the institutional suspicion sharpened by Oxford, and the early presence of Hume as both challenge and companion. None of this made the wealth of nations inevitable. Nothing in the young Smith required him to become the emblem later centuries would construct. What it did give him was a method of attention, to ask how people judge, how institutions reward, how societies improve, and how unintended arrangements grow out of ordinary human conduct. The next stage of his life would turn that attention outward. Scotland in the 1740s and 1750s was ready to listen to lectures that connected morals, law, commerce, and public life, and Smith was ready to become more than a student of other men's systems. His education had ended in the formal sense, but his real career began when he stood before listeners and started shaping the questions that would carry him toward his first great book. Chapter 3: Glasgow and the Moral World. Edinburgh gave Adam Smith his first real public reputation. After the years at Glasgow and Oxford, he returned to Scotland with learning, but learning alone did not secure a place in the intellectual life of the country. A young man needed listeners, patrons, visible judgment, and the approval of people whose names carried weight in legal and literary circles. Edinburgh offered those conditions. Its clubs, drawing rooms, law courts, printing houses, medical lectures, and church debates made it the kind of city where a serious mind could be tested in public before it was given institutional authority. Smith began delivering lectures in Edinburgh around 1748, under the patronage and encouragement of figures such as Henry Home, later Lord Kames. These lectures covered rhetoric, belles lettres, jurisprudence, and other subjects that belonged to the wide 18th-century field of moral and civic education. They were not merely exercises in style. To lecture on rhetoric in this period was to ask how language shaped judgment, how persuasion worked on the mind, and how societies formed standards of taste and conduct. Smith's later concern with spectators, sympathy, and public judgment had roots in this world where speech and moral life were never entirely separate. The Edinburgh lectures also showed that Smith could make thought orderly before an audience. He was not remembered as a dazzling performer, and no one made him into a theatrical orator. His strength lay elsewhere. He could unfold a subject patiently, distinguish one idea from another, and give listeners the sense that social life had hidden patterns worth following. In a city full of lawyers and ambitious students, that gift mattered. Law trained men to care about evidence and distinction, while polite letters taught them to care about judgment, manners, and the force of expression. Lord Kames saw enough in Smith to help bring him forward. Kames himself belonged to that remarkable Scottish type: judge, land improver, philosopher, patron, and organizer of conversation. He understood that Scotland's intellectual life depended not only on books, but on networks. A young scholar who impressed the right listeners could move toward a chair, a patron, or a circle of friends who would enlarge his reach. Smith's public lectures were therefore more than temporary employment. They were the stage on which he became visible to the world that could use him. In 1751, Smith was appointed Professor of Logic at the University of Glasgow. The title sounds narrower than the work it involved, because logic in that older curriculum belonged to the training of thought itself. Students learned how ideas were ordered, how arguments were formed, and how language could be made clear enough for public use. Smith did not hold the chair for long before moving to the more important post of Professor of Moral Philosophy in 1752. But the appointment marked his entry into the university as a teacher with recognized authority. Glasgow, the place of his own early formation, had now become the place where he would form others. The moral philosophy chair carried a wide burden. It included natural theology, ethics, jurisprudence, and political questions that would later be separated into different disciplines. A professor in that chair was expected to guide young men through the principles of duty, justice, law, government, and social order. Smith inherited a structure shaped strongly by Hutcheson, but he did not merely repeat his teacher's system. He used the inherited frame to ask his own questions about how people come to judge conduct, how rules become stable, and how social life operates through feelings as well as commands. Glasgow students came from families preparing them for professions, churches, estates, commerce, or colonial opportunities. Some were very young. Some were older and more serious. Many paid fees directly to the professors whose lectures they attended, a financial arrangement that tied teaching to reputation in a concrete way. A professor who bored or neglected his pupils could suffer in both esteem and income. This gave Scottish university teaching a practical energy that Smith later contrasted with institutions where salaries were secure regardless of effort. The lesson returned in his political economy. Incentives shape conduct because institutions quietly teach people what kinds of conduct will be rewarded. Moral philosophy, as Smith taught it, did not begin with markets. It began with human beings watching one another. People praised, blamed, admired, resented, imitated, and corrected themselves through the imagined presence of others. A person alone with his own appetite was never Smith's basic unit of society. The basic unit was already social. A creature who wanted approval, feared contempt, felt sympathy unevenly, and learned to stand at a slight distance from himself. This was the moral world before the economic one, and for Smith, the second would never fully escape the first. The lectures also carried him toward jurisprudence. Law interested Smith because it showed moral life becoming institutional. Rules about property, contract, inheritance, punishment, and authority did not float above history. They developed unevenly, shaped by conquest, custom, rank, commerce, and the changing needs of societies. Smith's later writings on wealth would depend heavily on this historical sense of law. He did not imagine exchange taking place in an empty field between two abstract individuals. He knew that property had to be defined, contracts enforced, roads maintained, money trusted, and violence restrained before markets could become ordinary. David Hume stood near this development, though not as a university colleague. Hume, older than Smith by more than a decade, had already unsettled readers with his philosophical skepticism and was beginning to build the reputation that would make him one of the central minds of the age. Their friendship grew into one of the great intellectual companionships of 18th-century Britain. Hume's temperament was different from Smith's, broader in some ways, more playful, more willing to provoke. Smith was more guarded, more systematic, and more cautious in public. Between them ran a shared confidence that human society could be studied historically, morally, and naturally, without reducing it to sermons or abstractions. Glasgow itself kept pressing economic realities into view. The city was tied increasingly to Atlantic trade, especially tobacco imported through connections with the American colonies. Merchants accumulated wealth, built houses, funded improvements, and changed the social texture of the town. This commerce rested on imperial systems and, in the Atlantic world, on enslaved labor whose human cost was often kept distant from the polite spaces where profits appeared as refinement. Smith would later criticize slavery as inefficient and morally troubling within the limits of his age's language, and he would treat colonial monopoly with suspicion. The commercial world around Glasgow was therefore both evidence of expanding wealth and evidence that wealth could be entangled with domination. Students listening to Smith would not have heard a finished version of The Wealth of Nations. They would have heard the slow formation of a mind connecting moral judgment, legal development, and economic order. His lectures on jurisprudence, preserved only through later student notes, show him thinking historically about government, property, police, revenue, and arms. The word police in that setting did not mean only officers enforcing law. It referred more broadly to the regulation of internal order, including cleanliness, markets, prices, and public convenience. Such terms remind us how different the 18th century map of knowledge was from the modern one. Smith's daily life as a professor had its own regular demands. Lectures had to be prepared and delivered. Students had to be managed. Faculty duties, university ceremonies, and social obligations occupied time. Professors lived within a small world where reputation could be strengthened by brilliance and harmed by neglect, awkwardness, or theological suspicion. Smith, though absent-minded in manner, seems to have been respected and liked by many of his students. His thought was serious without being cold. Those who later remembered him often recalled not only his intellect, but his benevolence, his oddities, and his capacity for friendship. Out of this teaching life came the material for his first great book. The movement from lecture to printed work was not sudden. Ideas tried before students could be refined, rearranged, expanded, and made more exact. The classroom gave Smith a testing ground where problems of sympathy, merit, judgment, ambition, resentment, self-command, and moral approval could be worked through in sequence. His later prose has the feeling of a lecturer who has walked a subject many times before, asking it to stand as a book. It proceeds patiently because it was trained in patient explanation. The most important thing forming in Glasgow was Smith's account of how people live under the eyes of others. He noticed that moral life depends on imagination, but not fantasy. To judge another person, one tries to enter his situation, though always imperfectly. To judge oneself, one imagines a spectator who is better placed than one's vanity or fear. This inward spectator is not identical with conscience in the older religious sense, and it is not simply public opinion. It is a social faculty turned inward, shaped by living among people whose approval and disapproval gradually become part of the self. Such ideas could have remained lectures forever. Many university thoughts do. Smith, however, was writing in a Scotland unusually able to turn teaching into books and books into reputation. Printers, reviewers, correspondents, patrons, and clubs linked the lecture hall to the wider British reading public. A professor in Glasgow could speak to students in one decade and, with the right book, become known in London and beyond in the next. Smith's first step into that wider world would not be a treatise on trade, but a study of sympathy and judgment, a work that made his name before the market ever claimed him. By the late 1750s, the shape of that work had become clear enough to leave the classroom. Smith had taken the moral questions of Hutcheson's world, passed them through his own cooler and more intricate mind, and prepared them for print. Glasgow had given him more than employment. It had given him a discipline of teaching, a city where commerce and morality touched, students before whom arguments could be tested, and a philosophical problem large enough to sustain his first major act as an author. Chapter 4. The Theory of Moral Sentiments. The book that first made Adam Smith known was not about profit, trade, or the machinery of national wealth. It appeared in 1759 under the title The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and it came from the Glasgow lectures in which Smith had been thinking through the life of judgment, sympathy, self-command, approval, resentment, and conscience. A later world would often rush past this book on the way to the wealth of nations, as if it were only a youthful prelude to the real matter. For Smith himself, it was no prelude. It was the work that established his reputation, and it remained central enough to him that he revised it again and again across the rest of his life. The 18th century cared deeply about the foundations of morality. Philosophers, ministers, lawyers, and educated readers argued over whether virtue came from reason, divine command, natural affection, utility, social order, or some inward moral sense. Smith inherited this conversation from his teacher Francis Hutcheson, from ancient moral philosophy, from Christian moral habits, and from the skeptical intelligence of David Hume. His answer did not begin with a lawgiver or an abstract rule. It began with a human scene so ordinary that it was easy to miss, one person observing another, trying to understand what that other person feels, and measuring the response that follows. Smith's word for this capacity was sympathy, but he did not mean only tenderness or pity. Sympathy, for him, was the act of entering imaginatively into another person's situation. A person sees grief, anger, joy, humiliation, ambition, injury, or gratitude in someone else, and then attempts to feel along with it from a distance. The attempt is always imperfect. No one can fully enter another mind. Yet the effort itself becomes one of the foundations of moral life, because people judge conduct by asking whether the feelings behind it seem suitable to the situation. This was a delicate way to build a moral theory. Smith did not describe human beings as cold calculators who first discover rules and then apply them to life. Nor did he treat them as pure fountains of benevolence. People approve, disapprove, resent, forgive, admire, envy, and excuse through a social imagination formed by experience. They do not merely ask what happened. They ask whether the anger was too strong, whether the grief was proportionate, whether the pride was tolerable, whether the gratitude was deserved. Moral judgment begins in this shifting comparison between a situation and the sentiments it seems to call forth. The book's central figure was the impartial spectator. Smith used this idea to explain how human beings learn to judge themselves. A person does not see his own conduct only from inside his own appetite, fear, vanity, or hurt. He can divide himself inwardly, as if placing before his own actions a spectator who is better informed, calmer, fairer, and less captive to self-love. This spectator is not a literal person, and not merely the crowd's opinion. It is the imagined standpoint from which one tries to see one's own behavior as another reasonable human being might see it. The idea had great subtlety because Smith knew how partial people usually are. Each person naturally feels his own pain more strongly than the pain of others. A small injury to oneself can seem larger than a distant catastrophe. Personal ambition can dress itself as merit. Resentment can appear as justice when it belongs to one's own wound. The impartial spectator does not erase these distortions, but it gives moral life a method of correction. People learn self-command not by ceasing to care about themselves, but by learning that their own feelings must be made visible to an imagined judge who is not identical with their immediate desire. A printed copy of the Theory of Moral Sentiments carried into the British reading world a Glasgow professor's long classroom labour. The book was published in London by Andrew Millar, a leading bookseller whose role placed Smith inside the serious commercial life of 18th-century print. Printed books moved through shops, reviews, private letters, circulating libraries, and the hands of readers who might never meet the author. Smith had spent years speaking to students in a lecture hall. Now the same moral architecture passed into a wider world where its author became known as something more than a promising Scottish teacher. David Hume understood quickly what the book had done for his friend. Hume wrote to Smith with pleasure, teasing warmth and real admiration, reporting its favourable reception in London. Their friendship gives the moment a human scale. Hume was already famous and controversial, admired for his intelligence and distrusted for his skepticism. Smith was more cautious in public, less eager to provoke, and more guarded in religious matters. Yet the two men shared a deep intellectual companionship, and Hume's approval mattered because it came from someone who knew the difficulty of writing about human nature without hiding behind easy pieties. The reception of the book helped lift Smith into the first rank of British moral philosophers. Edmund Burke admired it. Educated readers found in it a moral psychology both refined and recognizable. It explained the theatre of ordinary conduct without making that conduct trivial. People knew from daily life that praise and blame did not operate like geometry. They knew that a person could be generous in public and vain in motive, injured yet excessive in resentment, modest in speech yet hungry for admiration. Smith gave these familiar tensions an organized language. His method depended on observation more than command. Instead of beginning by announcing duties from above, he moved through the ways people actually respond to one another. A generous act is admired partly because the observer can sympathize with the affection behind it. Cruelty is condemned because the spectator cannot enter into the excess of harm. Resentment has a proper place when it answers real injury, yet it becomes ugly when it outruns its cause. Gratitude, ambition, shame, grief, and pride all pass before the spectator's judgment, each measured against circumstance. Smith's moral world was therefore social from its first movement. A person becomes moral among others, not in isolation. Even solitude carries society inward, because the imagined spectator has been formed through living with real spectators. A child learns approval before he can name virtue. An adult learns that dignity often means lowering the volume of private feeling until others can accompany it. This was one reason self-command mattered so much to Smith. He admired the capacity to bear pain, success, disappointment, and desire without demanding that the whole world bend itself around one's own inner weather. The idea may sound restrained, but it was not empty politeness. Smith understood that societies often admire the rich and powerful more than they deserve, and overlook the poor and humble more easily than justice permits. In the Theory of Moral Sentiments, he wrote with unusual sharpness about the human tendency to worship rank. People gaze at the wealthy, imagine their lives as more complete than they are, and mistake outward splendor for inward happiness. This error was not a small social inconvenience. For Smith, it helped explain why ambition drives people into exhausting pursuits and why inequality can command admiration even when it does not command moral respect. That passage matters for the later Smith. The man who would write about markets had already written about the moral danger of confusing wealth with worth. He did not deny that people sought better conditions, nor did he scold ordinary ambition as though poverty were noble in itself. His insight was quieter and more troubling. Human beings are drawn toward visible success, and society often rewards the appearance of happiness with more attention than it gives to virtue. Long before modern consumer culture, Smith saw that economic life was also a theatre of imagination. The book also gave Smith a way to think about justice. Beneficence, in his account, is beautiful, but cannot always be forced. People may fail to be generous without becoming criminals. Justice is different. It is the foundation without which social life becomes insecure, because injury, violence, fraud, and violation of rights make ordinary trust impossible. This distinction would matter later in his political economy. Commercial society could not rest on kindness alone. It required rules, courts, property, contract, and enforcement, because people needed a stable framework in which ordinary expectation could survive. Smith's moral philosophy was not sentimental in the soft sense. It had room for tenderness, but it was equally concerned with discipline, propriety, resentment, punishment, status, and law. He knew that sympathy could fail. People sympathize more easily with those near them than with those far away, more readily with success than with misery, more comfortably with the polished than with the obscure. Moral life, in his view, was not guaranteed by feeling. It was an effort to educate feeling until it became less crude, less vain, and less obedient to immediate self-love. Across the book, ancient philosophy remained present. Smith admired the Stoics, especially their concern with self-command and the government of the passions. Though he did not simply become one of them, he drew from classical examples because 18th-century readers still inhabited a learned world in which Greece and Rome offered moral vocabulary. The ancient material did not make the book antique. It allowed Smith to compare commercial modern life with older visions of virtue, dignity, fortune, and public conduct. A Glasgow professor writing in the Age of Trade still carried Seneca, Cicero, and Epictetus near his desk. The success of the theory of moral sentiments changed Smith's standing. He was no longer only a respected teacher at Glasgow. He had become an author of European importance, a thinker whose account of moral judgment could travel beyond the students who heard him in person. This mattered practically as well as intellectually. Reputation opened doors. It brought him to the notice of patrons. It made him a plausible companion and tutor for aristocratic travel. It placed his name among the men whose conversation was worth seeking. Yet the book did something even more lasting inside Smith's own development. It established the human being he would later place inside economic life. That person was self-interested, certainly. But not only self-interested. He wanted approval, feared blame, admired rank, judged conduct, misunderstood happiness, sought improvement, and lived under rules formed by society before he entered the marketplace. The butcher, brewer, and baker of the later famous passage would not belong to a world without morals. They would belong to the same human order Smith had already described, people seeking their own purposes while living under the judgment of others. When Smith moved beyond Glasgow into the next stage of his life, he carried the authority of this first book with him. Its pages had given him public standing, but they had also fixed the deeper foundation of his thought. Markets, when they finally became his great subject, would not appear as machines outside morality. They would appear as human arrangements, built by flawed social creatures who could cooperate, deceive, admire, misjudge, improve, and corrupt themselves. The road from moral sentiments to national wealth was therefore not a departure from Smith's first concerns. It was the widening of them. Chapter 5. A Philosopher Among Patrons. Charles Townshend entered Adam Smith's life through the older world of rank, recommendation, and private influence. In 18th-century Britain, A scholar could earn reputation through books and lectures, but reputation did not always become security by itself. Offices, pensions, appointments, and opportunities often moved through people of standing who knew which minds were useful, which tutors could be trusted, and which gentlemen needed the polish of serious instruction. Smith's success with the theory of moral sentiments had made him visible beyond Glasgow, and visibility brought him toward a life very different from the ordered duties of a university chair. Townshend was an ambitious politician, clever, socially powerful, and connected to one of the great Scottish aristocratic families through his marriage to Caroline Campbell, the widow of the previous Duke of Buccleuch. Her son, Henry Scott, the young Duke, required the education expected of a man who would inherit land, influence, and political consequence. The Grand Tour, already a recognized part of elite formation, was not merely travel for pleasure. It was a moving education in manners, languages, politics, art, law, conversation, and the hierarchy of European society. A young nobleman went abroad to learn how to inhabit the rank he already possessed. Smith was chosen to accompany the Duke as tutor, and the appointment changed the practical conditions of his life. He resigned from his professorship at Glasgow in 1764, leaving behind students, lectures, faculty obligations, and the institutional home that had formed much of his early thought. The financial terms were generous by academic standards, giving him a pension that would support him long after the journey ended. This mattered because intellectual independence in that age rarely arrived as pure independence. It often came through the favor of those whose wealth freed a scholar from more immediate labor. The decision was not a small one. Smith had been a successful professor, respected by students, and known through his first book. Glasgow had given him a place where his mind could work in public, where lectures could be shaped and reshaped, and where younger men could carry away his ideas. To leave it meant exchanging steady academic identity for the uncertain intimacy of aristocratic service. A tutor to a duke was neither servant in the ordinary sense nor equal in rank. He occupied a delicate social position, trusted with moral and intellectual guidance, while always aware of the distance between his own birth and the world into which his pupil had been born. Patronage often looks, from a later distance, like a soft form of dependency. It was that, but it was also one of the main structures through which 18th-century learning moved. Books needed publishers, scholars needed introductions, travelers needed letters, and young men of rank needed guides who could make Europe intelligible to them. The arrangement could flatter wealth, but it could also bring a serious mind into contact with courts, salons, ministries, libraries, and conversations unavailable from a university town. Smith accepted not only a salary, but access to a wider political and intellectual map. The young Duke of Buccleuch was still in formation when Smith took charge of him. His education required more than reading. He needed to learn conduct among elites, how to observe foreign institutions, how to move through Catholic and Protestant settings, how to understand languages and ceremonies, and how to become the sort of aristocrat who could return to Britain with cultivated judgment. Smith's role was therefore moral as well as intellectual. The author of the theory of moral sentiments was now asked to guide a young nobleman through a world where rank constantly invited admiration and vanity. That task suited Smith in ways that are easy to overlook. He had written about the human tendency to admire wealth and greatness too readily. Now he traveled beside a young man born into both. The Duke's position opened doors, but it also placed him under a permanent social gaze. Smith could see, in daily practice, how rank educated the person who possessed it. The rich were watched, received, praised, instructed, and expected to perform a version of themselves. In such a world, moral self-command was not an abstract virtue. It was part of the discipline required to pass through society without being ruined by its attention. Their journey began in France, where Smith and the Duke spent a long period in Toulouse. The city was not Paris, and that was part of its value. Away from the capital's highest salons, the travelers encountered provincial French society, legal institutions, local manners, and the slower rhythms of a kingdom whose administration differed greatly from Britain's. For Smith, France offered living evidence of another political order. Its monarchy, tax structures, social ranks, church presence, and legal habits gave him material for comparison. Political economy, for him, would always depend on such comparisons, because no society explained itself fully when viewed alone. The Grand Tour unfolded through the practical labor of movement. Coaches, inns, letters of introduction, servants, luggage, road conditions, local officials, and the timing of visits shaped the experience as much as books and conversation did. Travel across Europe was education, partly because it was inconvenient. Distances had to be endured. Customs had to be negotiated. Money had to be changed or carried with care. A tutor responsible for a noble pupil had to think about health, reputation, contacts, and schedule, not only about the next ancient ruin or philosophical meeting. Smith's letters from this period do not give a dramatic confession of inward transformation. He was not a man who turned experience into theatrical self-display. Yet the movement from Glasgow to France placed him near questions that would later fill the wealth of nations: taxation, agriculture, regulation, consumption, inequality, and the relation between government policy and ordinary prosperity. He had known Scottish commercial life from Glasgow and Kirkcaldy. In France, he saw a richer and larger kingdom, whose burdens were distributed through very different institutions. The comparison mattered more than any single scene. Toulouse also brought boredom. Smith, removed from his familiar intellectual circle, had stretches of time that did not satisfy him. This dullness became productive. A mind accustomed to lectures and argument could turn inward when public stimulation was thin. The great book on political economy did not yet exist as a finished structure, but some of its labor seems to have deepened during these traveling years. Long pauses, unfamiliar institutions, and distance from Scotland gave Smith a different vantage point from which to reconsider the lectures and materials he had been gathering. After Toulouse came movement toward Geneva and then Paris, where the journey became more intellectually charged. Geneva had the prestige of a small republic associated with Protestant learning, political argument, and the fame of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, though Smith's relation to Rousseau was indirect and complicated by the tensions of the time. Voltaire's presence near Geneva added another kind of celebrity to the landscape. The European Republic of Letters was not a single institution, but it had recognizable centers, rituals, reputations, and rivalries. A traveler with the right introductions could pass from one circle into another, carrying news, books, judgments, and names. Paris mattered most because it placed Smith near the French economists. There he encountered men such as François Quesnay and Anne-Robert Jacques Turgot, thinkers who were trying to understand wealth, agriculture, taxation, and reform with unusual systematic ambition. The physiocrats, as they came to be known, believed that land and agricultural production formed the true source of economic surplus. Smith would not accept their system whole, but he respected their seriousness and clarity. They treated economic life as something governed by principles rather than merely by custom, privilege, and the immediate needs of the treasury. Quesnay was especially important as a figure of intellectual organization. A physician at court and a thinker of striking confidence, he produced the famous Tableau économique, an attempt to show the circulation of wealth through the classes of society. The table reduced a kingdom's economic life into a pattern of flows, returns, and productive relations. Smith's own method would differ, and he would later reject the physiocratic claim that only agriculture was truly productive. Still, the encounter sharpened his sense that national wealth could be studied as a system, with parts connected across distance. Turgot represented another side of French economic thought: reform under the pressure of government. he was not merely a salon theorist. He was an administrator and later a minister, concerned with grain trade, taxation, labor obligations, and the obstacles that privilege placed in the way of improvement. In France, questions about free commerce in grain were not abstract. Bread was a political substance. Harvests, prices, transport, and regulation touched the stability of the kingdom. To speak about trade in grain was to speak about hunger, order, authority, and the fear of unrest. Smith listened, absorbed, questioned, and compared. He did not return from France as a disciple of the physiocrats, though he admired them enough that he may once have considered dedicating the wealth of nations to Quesnay had Quesnay lived. Their influence lay partly in opposition. By seeing what they explained powerfully and what they narrowed too much, Smith clarified his own broader understanding of labor, exchange, manufacturing, and commercial society. France gave him a system to learn from, and also a system to move beyond. The Duke of Buccleuch's tour ended under the shadow of loss. The Duke's younger brother, Hugh Campbell Scott, who had joined them, became ill and died in Paris in 1766. Smith's duty as tutor and guardian now included the sober responsibilities that followed a young man's death far from home. The event ended the journey and brought Smith back to Britain. The private grief of the family does not need enlargement to matter. It marked the close of an episode that had begun as elite education and ended with the fragility that no rank could prevent. Smith returned with his finances strengthened, his experience widened, and his mind stocked with comparisons that Glasgow alone could not have supplied. He had seen French administration, physiocratic theory, aristocratic travel, Republican Geneva, Parisian conversation, and the practical dependence of high culture on letters, introductions, and money. He had also lived inside the moral tensions of rank more closely than before. The author who had analyzed admiration for the great had spent 2 years moving through rooms opened by greatness. The next long labour would not take place in Paris or London, but back in Scotland, in the quieter orbit of Kirkcaldy and his mother's household. There, away from students and salons, Smith would begin turning years of lectures, travel, reading, comparison, and reflection into the book that would make his name impossible to remove from the history of modern economic life. The grand tour had expanded the world before him. The work ahead required him to sit still long enough to understand what he had seen. Chapter 6: France, Geneva, and the Economists of Grain. France widened Adam Smith's world because it placed him inside a kingdom where wealth, rank, cultivation, and administrative burden stood visibly beside one another. He had known Scotland's universities, ports, and improving circles, and he had seen Oxford's older institutional habits, but France offered a different scale. It was larger, richer, more ceremonious, and more heavily marked by privilege. The young Duke of Buccleuch's rank opened rooms that would not have opened to an ordinary Scottish professor, and Smith entered them as tutor, companion, observer, and philosopher, carrying with him the habits of comparison that his education had made almost instinctive. Toulouse was the first long French station, and its distance from Paris mattered. A traveller who knew only the capital might mistake the kingdom's glitter for the whole of France, but provincial life made another side of the country visible. Law courts, local elites, church institutions, tax arrangements, municipal forms, and regional customs gave the place a density that was not theatrical. Smith did not leave a full private diary that allows every impression to be recovered, yet the shape of his later thought suggests what such experience gave him. It allowed him to compare Britain and France, not as abstractions, but as societies with different arrangements for property, rank, revenue, agriculture, and trade. The months in Toulouse were not always lively. Smith seems to have found the city dull at times, cut off from the intellectual companionship he had enjoyed in Scotland. That dullness had its own use. Removed from Glasgow lectures and Edinburgh conversation, he had long stretches in which old materials could be reconsidered. A book that would eventually range across labor, agriculture, colonies, taxation, money, wages, and government could not be assembled from one kind of experience. It required years of storage inside the mind, and travel gave Smith new shelves on which to arrange what he already knew. French society also sharpened the problem of rank. Smith had written in The Theory of Moral Sentiments about the human tendency to admire the rich and powerful, and now he moved through a world where rank was ceremonial, visible, and carefully graduated. Doors opened because of the Duke. Letters introduced one gentleman to another. Meals, visits, and conversations followed rules that marked station as plainly as clothing did. Smith was not naive about this. He understood that wealth and rank could make men appear wiser, happier, and more deserving than they were, simply because human imagination dresses high condition in borrowed light. The economic life behind that rank was more strained than the surface suggested. France possessed fertile land, skilled artisans, important ports, and a court culture admired across Europe, but its fiscal system was uneven and heavy. Taxation fell through layers of privilege, exemptions, offices, leases, and regional differences. Some paid sharply, while others were shielded by status or corporate right. The state needed revenue, but revenue was gathered through arrangements that often made reform difficult. Smith's later suspicion of complicated systems of preference and protection did not emerge in a vacuum. France gave him a powerful example of a wealthy society hindered by the way its own institutions distributed burden and permission. Agriculture stood near the center of French debate. Grain was not just another commodity in the 18th century. It was bread, and bread belonged to public order. A bad harvest, a price rise, a blocked road, or a rumor of hoarding could become a political danger before any theory had time to speak calmly about supply and demand. Governments tried to manage grain because hunger made authority fragile. Reformers asked whether regulation itself worsened the trouble by preventing grain from moving where it was needed. Smith entered France while such questions were alive, and they would matter deeply to the political economy, he later wrote. Paris brought him closer to the men who had turned these questions into a system. The French economistes, later called physiocrats, believed that the wealth of a nation had a natural order and that government should understand that order rather than smother it beneath arbitrary regulation. Their central claim was bold: agriculture alone produced a true surplus, while manufacturing and trade transformed or circulated wealth without creating it in the same primary sense. Smith would reject that narrow conclusion, but he took the group seriously because they were asking the right kind of large question. They wanted to know how a whole society reproduced itself. François Quesnay gave the movement its most memorable intellectual object. His tableau économique attempted to show the circulation of wealth through the kingdom, reducing social classes and economic flows into a pattern that could be studied. Quesnay was physician to Madame de Pompadour and moved within courtly proximity, yet his mind reached toward an abstract model of national life. There is a quiet oddity in that fact. One of the earliest systematic images of economic circulation came from a court physician thinking about society almost as if it had a body with channels, returns, and obstructions. Smith's own method would be more historical and less diagrammatic, but he could recognize the ambition. The physiocratic circle had a language of order that appealed to reforming minds. They spoke of natural liberty, especially in relation to trade in grain, and criticized policies that bound production and exchange inside inherited restraints. For them, agriculture deserved freedom because the land was the source from which social wealth renewed itself. Farmers needed security, prices needed space to move, and the state needed to stop treating economic life as a treasury to be raided through short-term devices. These arguments did not simply flatter landowners. They challenged many practices of regulation and privilege that had grown familiar through long use. Anne Robert Jacques Turgot gave physiocratic and reforming thought another character. He was not merely a man of conversation. He had administrative responsibility and would later try, with limited time and fierce opposition, to reform parts of the French system. Turgot understood grain policy, labor obligations, taxation, and the difficulty of turning theory into law. For Smith, such men mattered because they stood at the crossing of ideas and government. A theory about free commerce became more serious when held by someone who had to think about roads, harvests, riots, tax collectors, and ministers. Smith did not become a physiocrat, and the difference is essential. He admired their attempt to treat economic life as governed by principles, but he would not confine productivity to agriculture. Manufacturing and commerce, in his later account, would have their own power to increase wealth through labor, specialization, capital, and exchange. A pin factory could reveal as much about production as a field, a workshop, a port, a road, and a market town could not be dismissed as sterile simply because they did not draw grain from the earth. Smith learned from the French system, partly by finding where it was too small for the world it tried to explain. Paris also exposed Smith to the culture of conversation. Salons, dinners, and private gatherings carried intellectual life through forms of sociability that differed from the lecture hall. Ideas moved beside manners. Wit, reputation, rank, and argument shared the same rooms. A Scottish professor trained in orderly exposition entered a setting where thought often had to pass through elegance before it gained attention. This did not make the ideas shallow. French conversation could be exacting in its own way, but it taught through speed, social pressure, and the presence of listeners who judged style along with substance. The Duke's presence remained important throughout. Smith's access to French intellectual society was partly the access of a tutor attached to a great nobleman. His own reputation helped, but rank eased the passage. This was one of the contradictions of Enlightenment life. Philosophers wrote about nature, liberty, reason, improvement, and the public good, yet the movement of their ideas often depended on private introductions, aristocratic houses, courtly favor, and the fortunes of men born far above the people whose welfare theory claimed to consider. Geneva offered another political texture. It was smaller, republican in form, Protestant in inheritance, and intellectually charged by the presence and memory of figures such as Voltaire and Rousseau. Voltaire, living near Geneva at Ferney, had made himself into one of Europe's great literary powers, a man whose correspondence, theatre, historical writing, and polemic reached far beyond any one city. Rousseau, though absent from Smith's personal circle in any simple sense, had made Geneva part of Europe's moral imagination. The city and its surroundings suggested that small states could carry reputations larger than their territory. For Smith, Geneva's value lay in comparison. Britain, France, and Geneva represented different relations between liberty, authority, rank, religion, commerce, and civic identity. The Scottish Enlightenment was deeply comparative in this way. It did not ask only what one constitution declared or what one law commanded. It asked how societies passed through stages, how manners changed with subsistence and commerce, how institutions shaped conduct, and how public order could arise from habits no legislator had fully designed. Travel supplied the materials for such thinking with a vividness no library could provide by itself. The world of books accompanied the world of travel. Smith met people, but he also encountered systems already condensed into texts, tables, letters, and reputations. The 18th-century Republic of Letters relied on printed pages moving between cities and on private correspondence that worked like an informal postal road of the mind. A name mentioned at dinner could lead to a book. A book could lead to an introduction. An introduction could lead to a conversation that changed how a chapter would later be written. Intellectual life was social, but it left paper behind. One of the striking features of Smith's French experience is how little theatrical self-reporting it produced. He did not turn the journey into a memoir of revelation. He did not cast himself as a pilgrim arriving at the shrine of economic truth. The effect was quieter. France entered his later work as comparison, correction, and stored observation. Its agriculture, regulations, tax burdens, reformers, salons, and administrative habits became part of the background against which he would write about natural liberty, productive labor, monopoly, revenue, and the mistakes of statesmen who believed they could manage society like a chessboard. The chessboard image would appear in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, where Smith warned against the man of system who imagines he can arrange human beings as if they were pieces moved by his hand. France made that warning more concrete. Reform was needed, and Smith knew it. Bad policy could impoverish people and distort trade. Yet, a reformer could also become dangerous if he forgot that human beings had principles of motion of their own. Political economy, for Smith, had to steer between blind custom and arrogant design. That balance became one of the deepest marks of his thought. The death of Hugh Campbell Scott, the Duke of Buccleuch's younger brother, darkened the end of the tour. He fell ill in Paris and died in 1766. Bringing the journey to a close in sorrow rather than intellectual completion. Smith's role shifted from tutor in a program of education to responsible companion in a family loss far from home. The event belongs to the record without needing elaboration. It reminds the Chronicle that even the most privileged travel remained vulnerable to the ordinary limits of illness, distance, and grief. When Smith returned to Britain, he carried more than notes toward a future book. He had seen how a great kingdom fed itself and burdened itself, how reformers argued under monarchy, how rank opened doors, how salons gave ideas a social body, how small republics carried intellectual force, and how economic systems could explain brilliantly while still leaving something out. The Scottish professor who had once lectured on moral sentiments had now stood close to continental arguments about grain, land, taxation, and liberty. Those arguments would not become his doctrine unchanged. They would become pressure inside his own. The next long phase of Smith's life required withdrawal rather than movement. After France, Geneva, Paris, Quesnay, Turgot, Voltaire's shadow, and the disciplined companionship of the Duke's tour, he returned toward the quieter geography of Scotland. The book ahead would need the breadth of travel, but it would also need stillness, revision, and the familiar domestic shelter of Kirkcaldy. In that return, the wide European conversation began to settle into the slow labor of composition. Chapter 7. 10 Years in Kirkcaldy. Kirkcaldy received Adam Smith again after the long movement through France, Geneva, Paris, and the circles of continental political economy. The return did not look like the beginning of a revolution in thought. It looked, from the outside, like a scholar coming back to his mother's house, carrying papers, habits, memories, and unfinished arguments. The town had been the first ground of his life, and now it became the place where the materials gathered across decades could be slowly brought into order. A book about national wealth, imperial trade, labor, wages, agriculture, and government would take shape in a setting far removed from the ministries and exchanges that later readers imagined when they spoke his name. The years after the Buccleuch tour gave Smith something rare for an 18th-century intellectual: time with financial security. His arrangement as tutor had provided him with a pension, and that income allowed him to step away from the daily necessity of lectures. Glasgow had trained him to speak, to explain, to test ideas before students. France had widened his range of comparison. Kirkcaldy gave him the quiet, practical condition that neither university duty nor European travel could offer. It gave him enough stillness to turn old lectures and new observations into a book large enough to hold them. Margaret Douglas was still there, and the household mattered. Smith's mother had been the constant figure from his birth onward, and his return to live with her was not an incidental domestic note. The image of a famous economist writing beside the ordinary rhythms of family life can seem almost too gentle for the later force of his reputation, but it is one of the real shapes of his life. He was not a man cut loose from attachment. His work grew inside a domestic arrangement in which meals, letters, visitors, servants, local walks, and the presence of his mother formed the frame around long intellectual labor. The manuscript that became an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations did not begin from nothing in Kirkcaldy. Smith had lectured for years on jurisprudence, police, revenue, arms, commerce, and the development of social institutions. Student notes from his Glasgow lectures show that many of the later book's concerns had already been forming before the French tour. What changed in these years was not the sudden birth of a subject, but the gathering of scattered parts into architecture. Lecture material had to become argument. Argument had to become sequence. Sequence had to become a book that could travel without the voice of the lecturer beside it. Writing at this scale required more than inspiration. It required arrangement. Smith had to decide where to begin, how to move from labor to stock, from prices to wages, from agriculture to commerce, from colonies to public debt, from historical stages to present policy. The book's eventual structure would be large and uneven, as many great 18th-century works are. It would not resemble a modern economics textbook with clean diagrams and shortened definitions. It would move through history, law, moral observation, practical policy, and long criticism of systems that had grown powerful enough to feel natural. Kirkcaldy's own commercial life remained a useful background. The Fife Coast was not London, Amsterdam, or Bordeaux, but it was not cut off from exchange. Small ports made trade visible at a human scale. Goods had names, routes, duties, owners, risks, and prices. A town facing water could remind a writer that commerce was movement before it was theory. Ships required loading, credit required trust, and customs required offices where paper turned trade into revenue. Smith's later pages on trade would range widely, but they did not come from a mind unfamiliar with the ordinary mechanics by which goods passed from place to place. David Hume watched the long labor from a distance with the interest of a friend and fellow author. Hume knew what it meant to wait for the public judgment of a serious book, and he knew Smith well enough to understand both his brilliance and his delay. Their correspondence from these years reveals encouragement, teasing, practical advice, and intellectual companionship. Hume was the more openly skeptical figure, the historian and philosopher whose style could move more lightly over dangerous ground. Smith was slower, more guarded, and less eager to expose an unfinished thought. Their friendship gave the work a witness before publication. Hume's presence also mattered, because he represented another version of the Scottish Enlightenment's achievement. He had written history, philosophy, essays on commerce, and reflections on money, interest, balance of trade, and public credit. Smith did not merely borrow from him, but the two men shared a world of questions. How did order arise without central design? How did commerce alter manners? How did belief, custom, and interest shape institutions? How could one explain society through human nature without reducing human beings to crude appetite? In that shared field, Smith's book grew as part of a conversation larger than himself. The intellectual network around Smith extended beyond Hume. Joseph Black, the chemist, belonged to the same Scottish world of disciplined inquiry. James Hutton, whose later geological thought would widen the imagined age of the Earth, also stood within the circles of improvement, observation, and argument. Edinburgh and Glasgow were close enough that conversation, letters, visits, and reputation moved steadily between them. Scotland's smallness helped its intellectual life. A serious book written in Kirkcaldy could still belong to a national conversation, in which professors, physicians, lawyers, ministers, and landowners watched one another's work with unusual attention. Smith's own pace was deliberate. He was not a pamphleteer rushing to answer the week's controversy. The book he was building had to account for long processes: the division of labor, the accumulation of stock, the rise of towns, the relation between country and city, the policies of European states, the burdens of empire, and the strange persistence of economic errors. Each part touched other parts. A claim about wages led toward population, bargaining power, and the condition of laborers. A claim about trade led toward monopoly, colonies, shipping laws, and the political influence of merchants. The subject did not allow easy containment. This low composition also required Smith to confront the danger of systems. He had met the physiocrats and respected their clarity, yet their clarity came from making agriculture bear too much explanatory weight. He had seen the appeal of a simple organizing principle. He had also seen its limitation. His own book would criticize what he called systems of political economy, but it could not avoid becoming systematic in another way. The difficulty was to explain order without pretending that one formula could master all social life. Smith's solution was historical breadth. Instead of forcing every fact into one diagram, he let institutions change across time. The stages of society gave him one broad method. Hunting, shepherding, agriculture, and commerce were not rigid compartments into which every people could be neatly placed, but they offered a way to compare forms of property, law, authority, and dependence. In rougher societies, wealth might lie in herds or land. In commercial societies, it could appear through labor divided into many tasks. Capital advanced before returns came in, and exchange extended across distance. Smith used such comparisons to show that economic life had a history. Markets were not timeless scenes of isolated bargaining. They developed inside changing forms of social order. Labor stood at the center of the emerging book. Later readers would often remember Smith for free markets, but the opening of the wealth of nations would give labor the primary place in national wealth. A country was not rich merely because it possessed gold or silver. It was rich because its annual labor produced goods and services that sustained life and convenience. That turn mattered. It moved attention away from treasure and toward productive capacity, skill, organization, and the ordinary work of people whose names rarely entered political history. Smith's thought remained elite in many ways, but his subject forced him to look beyond elites. The division of labor became the book's first great explanatory engine. Smith had long understood that specialization could multiply productive power. One person doing every part of a task remained limited by time, skill, and tools. Many people dividing the task could produce far more, especially when repetition improved dexterity and machines simplified operations. Yet even here, his admiration was not blind. He would later warn that extreme division of labor could narrow the minds of workers unless public education corrected the damage. The same process that made society wealthier could make individual lives smaller if no institution answered it. Bread, wages, and subsistence kept the argument grounded. Political economy was not only a theory of merchants and statesmen. It concerned whether ordinary laborers could afford the necessities of life, whether rising wealth improved their condition, and whether policy favored the many or the few. Smith did not write as a modern egalitarian, but he repeatedly judged societies by the condition of the laboring poor. No society, he argued in one of his plainest moral moments, could be flourishing and happy if the greater part of its members were poor and miserable. That sentence would remain one of the most important checks on simplified versions of him. The long manuscript also gathered Smith's anger at monopoly. His criticism of merchants did not come from hostility to commerce itself. It came from his belief that merchants and manufacturers often sought to widen the market for themselves while narrowing competition against themselves. They praised liberty when they wanted access, and praised restriction when they wanted protection. Legislators, flattered or pressured by commercial interests, often confused private advantage with public good. Smith's suspicion here was not casual. It became one of the central moral and political warnings of the book. Empire entered the manuscript as both fact and problem. Britain's colonies, trade regulations, navigation laws, companies, debts, and wars belonged to the political economy of the age. Smith wrote during a period in which the American colonies were moving toward open rupture with Britain. He did not treat empire as a romantic mission. He examined its costs, its restrictions, and the illusions by which nations imagined distant possessions to be wealth when they might be burdens. His criticism did not free him from all assumptions of his century, but it kept him from worshipping imperial commerce as a simple good. Public debt also troubled him. 18th-century Britain had become a state capable of borrowing on a large scale, funding wars through credit and pushing burdens into the future. Smith understood the power of such a system, but he feared its temptations. Governments could spend more easily when the full cost did not fall at once on present taxpayers. War became easier to begin when payment could be postponed. The question was not only financial, it was moral and political, because debt altered the relation between rulers, citizens, and generations not yet present to object. Kirkcaldy's stillness therefore held an enormous range of movement inside it. On paper, Smith travelled through ancient societies, medieval towns, European monarchies, colonial systems, tax offices, workshops, farms, and trading networks. A man sitting in a Scottish coastal town wrote about the world by arranging evidence gathered from books, lectures, conversation, travel, and long comparison. This is one of the calmer paradoxes of intellectual history. Sometimes the widest works are made in places where the author hardly appears to move at all. The labour was slow enough that friends noticed. Hume, with affectionate impatience, urged Smith onward. Publishers waited. The reputation created by the theory of moral sentiments meant that a new work by Smith would attract attention, but that reputation also raised the burden. A lesser book might damage what the first had made. Smith's caution was part temperament and part discipline. He revised because he wanted the argument to stand beyond the room in which he could explain it himself. During these years, Britain itself kept changing around the unfinished book. Commercial expansion, imperial strain, agricultural improvement, manufacturing growth, and colonial tension all made the question of national wealth urgent. Political economy was not yet a fully separate discipline, but statesmen needed its language whether they knew it or not. How should colonies be taxed? What should be imported or protected? What made wages rise? Why did some nations grow rich while others remained poor? Should grain move freely? Did gold measure wealth, or did it merely signify claims on something more real? Smith's manuscript answered a world that was already asking. The American crisis gave the approaching publication a sharper edge. Smith was not writing propaganda for rebellion, but he was writing at a moment when Britain's imperial system was under visible stress. Policies of restriction and taxation, long defended as instruments of order and advantage, were producing resistance across the Atlantic. The same state that sought wealth through empire faced the cost of holding that empire together. When The Wealth of Nations appeared in 1776, readers would not encounter it in a calm political vacuum. They would read it while the imperial question had become impossible to ignore. Smith's life in Kirkcaldy did not have the outward drama that later biographers sometimes wish for. There were no battles, no elections won, no ministry taken, no public scandal by which to mark each year. The drama lay in the slow conversion of thought into form. Pages accumulated. Arguments were shifted. Examples found their place. Old lectures were absorbed into new architecture. French conversations settled beside Scottish observations. Hume's essays stood somewhere in the background. Hutcheson's moral seriousness remained deeper still. As the manuscript neared completion, Smith had become a different kind of author from the one who published the theory of moral sentiments. He was still a moral philosopher, but now his moral philosophy had passed through law, history, labor, commerce, and the fiscal habits of states. He did not abandon sympathy for self-interest. He placed self-interest inside a larger account of social cooperation and institutional design. The question before him was not whether people pursued advantage. Of course they did. The harder question was when private pursuit could serve public prosperity, when it corrupted policy, and what kind of legal order made the difference. Kirkcaldy had first given Smith a childhood among trade, custom, church, school, and maternal care. In these writing years, it gave him a second beginning. The child of the Fife Coast had returned as a philosopher with European experience, and the town became the workshop for a book that would leave Scotland almost immediately after publication. Its arguments were too large to remain local. They would pass into London print, parliamentary conversation, colonial controversy, academic debate, and eventually into the vocabulary of the modern world, where Smith's name would be repeated by people who knew the book, people who knew only a passage, and people who knew only the shadow of a phrase. Chapter 8. The book that changed political economy. The book appeared in 1776 with a title large enough to announce its ambition before any reader reached the first page, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. Adam Smith had spent years carrying its arguments through lectures, conversations, travel, private revision, and long work in Kirkcaldy, but publication changed the nature of the thing. A manuscript belongs to the author's caution. A printed book begins to belong to readers, critics, politicians, merchants, students, reformers, and later generations who will use it for purposes the writer could not fully govern. In March of that year, Smith's private labor entered the public world. London gave the book its commercial body. It was published by William Strahan and Thomas Cadell, men connected to the serious trade in books that carried Scottish thought into British and European readership. Strahan was not merely a mechanical printer at the edge of the story. He belonged to the world of correspondence, publishing judgment, political connection, and practical literary business through which 18th-century ideas travelled. Smith had written in Scotland, but the book had to pass through London print culture to become part of the larger argument about empire, commerce, and government. The timing has always tempted readers towards symbolism. In the same year, across the Atlantic, the American colonies declared independence from Britain. Smith's book was not written as a commentary on that declaration, and its causes ran much deeper than the events of a single political season. Yet the coincidence matters because the world into which it appeared was already troubled by the very problems Smith examined: taxation, monopoly, colonial restriction, public debt, imperial expense, and the belief that a mother country could grow rich by binding distant settlements to its own commercial advantage. The book did not create those questions. It gave them a language of unusual reach. Smith began not with gold, kings, colonies, or merchants, but with labor. That opening decision carried quiet force. Wealth, he argued, did not consist fundamentally in the quantity of precious metals a nation possessed, nor in the grandeur of its rulers, nor in the visible splendor of a few great houses. A nation's annual labor supplied the necessities and conveniences of life. This was a practical and moral rearrangement of attention. It moved the reader's eye toward work, skill, productivity, and the conditions under which ordinary people could be better or worse supplied. The famous first example was the pin factory. Smith described how the making of a simple pin could be divided into separate operations, each performed by different workers, producing vastly more than isolated labor could accomplish. The example was small enough for any reader to grasp and large enough to carry a theory of modern production. Division of labor increased dexterity, saved time lost in moving between tasks, and encouraged the invention of machines that simplified repeated work. A tiny manufactured object became a window into the growth of commercial society. Smith's choice of such an object was part of the book's power. He did not begin with a grand imperial company or a royal treasury. He began with something plain, slight, and easily overlooked. The pin factory allowed readers to see that national wealth was made through arrangements of labor that multiplied human effort. The point did not require spectacle. It required the recognition that the ordinary objects of daily life carried within them hidden cooperation among many hands, many tools, and many moments of practiced attention. Yet Smith's admiration for productivity was never simple celebration. The same division of labor that made society richer could narrow the life of the worker who performed one small operation again and again. In later parts of the book, Smith warned that a person confined to a few simple tasks might lose intellectual vitality unless public education intervened. This warning is often forgotten because it interrupts the cleaner myth of Smith as a man who believed markets solved every problem by themselves. He saw the productive force of specialization, but he also saw the human cost of reducing a life to mechanical repetition. The structure of the wealth of nations was broader than a modern reader may expect. It moved through labor, stock, prices, wages, profits, rent, agriculture, towns, trade policy, colonies, taxation, public debt, and the proper functions of government. Political economy had not yet become the narrower discipline later called economics. Smith wrote as a moral philosopher, historian, legal thinker, and observer of public policy. His book did not separate the market from the state as if the two belonged to different worlds. It asked how laws, institutions, habits, and interests shaped the production and distribution of wealth. One of Smith's central targets was mercantilism, the system of thought and policy that treated national wealth as if it were bound closely to the accumulation of gold and silver, favorable balances of trade, colonial preference, and protective regulation. Smith thought this way of seeing the world had led governments into error. Nations did not grow rich merely by hoarding precious metals or forcing trade into artificial channels. They grew wealthier when labor became more productive, exchange widened, capital accumulated, and legal order allowed people to pursue improvement without being trapped by unnecessary restraints. Merchants occupied an uneasy place in the book. Smith understood their importance and did not despise commerce. He knew that merchants connected markets, moved goods, advanced capital, and helped extend the division of labor across distance. But he also warned that merchants and manufacturers often sought policies that served themselves while being presented as national interest. They wanted larger markets for selling, narrower competition for buying, and legal privileges that secured advantage against rivals. Whenever they proposed regulation, Smith advised legislators to listen with caution. This suspicion gives the book much of its moral edge. The later image of Smith as a worshipper of business is difficult to reconcile with his repeated warnings about the people of the same trade gathering together, about monopoly, about the political influence of merchants, and about the danger of allowing private interest to dress itself in public language. Smith defended commercial freedom in large part because he distrusted the alliances between commercial power and political privilege. He did not imagine that businessmen became public benefactors by nature. He thought institutions had to be arranged so that private efforts could serve public plenty without giving private groups control over the rules. Colonies gave this critique a large field. Britain's imperial system tried to organize distant settlements around the advantage of the mother country, binding trade through navigation laws, restrictions, and preferences. Smith examined the system in terms of cost as well as pride. Empire could look like wealth because maps grew larger and trade routes multiplied, but the expense of defense, administration, monopoly, and war could burden the public more heavily than the supposed advantages justified. In a year when Britain's American crisis had become open rebellion, these arguments did not lie quietly on the page. Smith's discussion of the American colonies was careful and striking. He did not write as an American revolutionary, and he did not imagine colonial politics through later nationalist language. He analyzed the colonies as part of the imperial system and considered possible futures, including representation in Parliament or separation. What mattered most was that he refused to treat empire as a sacred possession beyond calculation. If the colonies cost more than they returned, if monopoly distorted trade, if imperial pride dragged the state into debt and conflict, then the old assumptions had to be examined like any other policy. Public debt formed another major concern. 18th-century Britain had learned to borrow on a scale that allowed it to fund wars and imperial commitments far beyond immediate revenue. Smith saw the capacity of credit, but he feared the habits it encouraged. When governments borrowed heavily, the cost of present ambition could be passed into the future. Wars became easier to sustain because their burden did not have to be felt at once. Debt, in Smith's treatment, was not only a financial mechanism, it was a way for political societies to hide from themselves the price of their own decisions. Taxation brought the book closer to administration. Smith's canons of taxation asked that taxes be proportionate, certain, convenient, and economical to collect. The language was calm, but the implications were strong. A tax system should not be arbitrary, obscure, needlessly painful, or expensive in its machinery. People had to know what they owed, when they owed it, and by what principle the burden fell. Such ideas may sound ordinary now because later public finance absorbed them, but in Smith's world they answered real systems filled with exemptions, privileges, leases, and uneven pressure. Government, in Smith's account, did not disappear. He assigned it essential duties: defense, justice, certain public works, certain public institutions, and forms of education where private provision would not be enough. This is another place where simplified versions of him often fail. Smith argued against many restraints and privileges, but he did not describe a society in which law withdrew into silence. Roads, bridges, courts, defense, basic education, and public order mattered because commercial society could not sustain itself without structures no individual trader had reason or capacity to provide alone. The early reception of the wealth of nations was serious, though it did not instantly transform the world in the manner later legend sometimes suggests. Its price and size meant that its first audience belonged mainly to educated and political circles. Statesmen, reformers, reviewers, scholars, and men of business could read it as a major intervention in questions already under debate. Some agreed with portions while resisting others. Some used it selectively. A book of that scale rarely persuades by sudden conquest. It enters conversation, supplies language, and slowly changes what intelligent people think can be said. David Hume, already ill in 1776, saw the book appear but did not live long enough to watch its full career. His friendship with Smith gives the publication a softer human border. Hume had urged him onward, and he understood the importance of the work more quickly than many. The Scottish Enlightenment had produced histories, moral theories, essays on commerce, legal thought, and scientific inquiry. Smith's new book gathered many of those energies into one enormous study of social order and material life. It belonged to his own mind, but it also belonged to the intellectual world that had made him possible. A reader opening the book in 1776 would not find the later discipline of economics fully formed. There were no modern graphs, no equations, no professionalized vocabulary of the sort students would later learn. Instead, the reader found long historical passages, examples from ancient and modern societies, policy criticism, moral observations and explanations that moved from a pin factory to the British Empire without treating either as separate from human conduct. The book's breadth can feel strange now because modern categories have divided what Smith still held together. That breadth helped the book endure. A narrower pamphlet against mercantilism might have served its moment and then faded into the shelves of specialists. Smith's work did more. It offered an account of how societies become materially better supplied, why labor grows productive, how markets widen, how policy distorts, how power protects itself, and why the wealth of a nation must be judged by more than the treasure of its rulers. Even where later economists corrected him, they often did so while standing on ground he helped clear. The book also changed Smith's public identity. He had already been respected as the author of the theory of moral sentiments, but the wealth of nations attached him to the great material questions of the age. After 1776, his name belonged not only to moral philosophy, but to trade, taxation, empire, labor, prices, and the state. That attachment would grow stronger with time until it nearly swallowed the earlier Smith. The moral philosopher remained inside the book, but later readers would often hear only the economist. Smith himself did not become a public agitator after publication. He did not campaign like a modern policy advocate or build a school around his own name. His influence moved through print, conversation, government circles, and gradual citation. The book's authority came partly from its tone. It did not sound like a revolutionary manifesto. It sounded like a patient inquiry by a man who had read widely, traveled carefully, listened seriously, and distrusted easy answers. What made the wealth of nations dangerous to old systems was not loudness, but steadiness. It asked whether policies defended as national wisdom were actually serving private interests. It asked whether colonial pride was worth its public cost. It asked whether wealth should be measured by bullion or by the productive labor and living condition of the people. It asked whether regulation improved society or merely protected those already close to power. Such questions could pass through polite language and still unsettle the habits of an empire. By the time the book began circulating, Adam Smith had given the modern world one of its most durable works without knowing what the modern world would do with it. He had not written a hymn to greed. He had not written a manual for corporations. He had not written the final answer to poverty, power, labor, or the state. He had written a vast inquiry into how human beings, working under laws and institutions, produce the material life of societies. The argument would now move beyond him, into policy, controversy, simplification, admiration, and misuse, while its next great questions waited inside the details of labor, value, wages, bread, and the lives of ordinary workers. Chapter 9. Labor, Value, and the Price of Bread. Labor stood at the entrance of Adam Smith's great book because he wanted to change where readers looked when they thought about wealth. A nation's prosperity did not begin, in his account, with the chest of a monarch, the bullion of a treasury, or the favorable balance that mercantilist writers had long treated as proof of national strength. It began with work. The annual labor of a people supplied what they ate, wore, used, traded, stored, and improved. Before wealth became an argument about policy, it was a question of human effort organized through skill, tools, habit, land, capital, and exchange. Smith's famous pin factory gave this argument its smallest and most memorable body. A pin was hardly an impressive object. It did not carry the grandeur of a ship, a palace, a cannon, or a trading company's charter. Yet precisely because it was small, it allowed Smith to show how production changed when labor was divided into separate operations. One worker drew out the wire, another straightened it, another cut it, another pointed it, another prepared the head. The finished object looked simple in the hand, but behind it stood a sequence of tasks arranged so that many people together could do what one person alone could barely approach. The lesson was not that pins mattered more than bread or cloth. It was that ordinary goods concealed social coordination. When labor was divided, productivity increased far beyond what isolated effort could produce. Smith named several reasons for this increase. Repetition made the worker more dexterous. Time was saved when a person no longer had to pass from one sort of task to another. Machinery became more likely because repeated operations invited mechanical assistance. The larger point was calm but powerful. Society became richer when human effort was organized so that each part supported many others. This was one of the places where Smith's thought carried both admiration and unease. He admired the productive force of specialization because it allowed a commercial society to supply goods in abundance. Yet he also understood that a person confined all day to a narrow operation might suffer in mind and character. The worker who spent life performing one small motion could become less able to exercise judgment, imagination, or civic understanding. Smith did not write this as a sentimental complaint against improvement. He wrote it as a warning that improvement in output could require public attention to the human beings who made it possible. Bread kept that warning close to the body. Political economy was not only about national grandeur, it was about whether laboring people could obtain the necessities of life. Wages mattered because they stood between work and subsistence. When wages were too low, the wealth of a nation could appear in the accounts of merchants, while the greater part of its people remained pressed by want. Smith was not a modern social democrat, and he did not use the language of later reform. Still, he wrote with unmistakable force that no society could be flourishing and happy if most of its members were poor and miserable. That sentence has survived because it restrains many later simplifications of him. Smith believed commercial society could improve the condition of ordinary people, but he did not measure prosperity only by the success of owners, traders, or governments. The price of bread, the level of wages, the regularity of employment, and the purchasing power of labor all belong to his understanding of national wealth. A rich country, in his account, was not merely one in which a few accumulated visible luxury. It was one in which the productive powers of labor made ordinary life better supplied. The relation between wages and wealth required care. Smith observed that wages tended to rise when a society was advancing, because demand for labor grew as stock accumulated and employers needed more hands. A stationary society could be rich in total possessions, but hard on workers if expansion had slowed. A declining society could be worse still, because competition among laborers for scarce employment pressed wages downward. This was not a mechanical law in the modern mathematical sense. It was a historical observation about movement. The condition of laborers depended not only on how much wealth existed, but on whether opportunity was widening. Employers and workers did not meet as equals. Smith's language on this point was direct. Masters could combine more easily than workmen, had fewer numbers, more resources, and often the support or sympathy of law. Workers, needing wages for immediate subsistence, could not wait as long. This imbalance mattered because the wage bargain was not a pure meeting of independent wills untouched by power. It took place inside differences of wealth, urgency, legal permission, and social respect. Smith's market world was therefore more layered than the later image of isolated buyers and sellers freely contracting on equal ground. Price gave Smith another way to explain order without assuming that order was always just. He distinguished between what he called natural price and market price. Natural price referred to the level sufficient to pay the ordinary rates of wages, profit, and rent needed to bring a commodity to market. Market price was the actual price at a given time, shaped by supply, demand, scarcity, accident, and local circumstance. The distinction allowed him to show movement without chaos. Prices could wander, sometimes sharply, but they tended around conditions created by costs, competition, and the organization of production. This did not mean that every price carried moral approval. Grain could become dear because harvests failed, transport broke down, laws prevented movement, or fear drove people to buy before need required it. Bread prices were especially dangerous because they touched everyone. For the poor, bread was not a symbol of the economy. It was the economy felt directly. A small change in price could alter the household's week. A larger rise could force choices between food, fuel, rent, and debt. Smith's political economy remained abstract enough to seek general principles, but its strongest claims often returned to the ordinary pressure of subsistence. Value itself was more difficult. Smith moved through the difference between value in use and value in exchange, showing that things most useful in life could have low exchange value, while things with little practical use could command much. Water and diamonds gave the classic contrast. Water was necessary, yet often cheap where it was plentiful. Diamonds were far less necessary, yet expensive because they were scarce and desired. The example helped detach price from simple usefulness. In commercial society, what something will exchange for depends on conditions beyond bare human need. Labor also served Smith as a way to think historically about value. In an early and simple state of society, before land was appropriated and stock accumulated, the labor required to acquire something might provide the clearest measure of its exchange. Once landlords and capital owners entered the picture, the matter became more complex. Prices then had to cover wages, rent, and profit. This movement in Smith's argument has troubled later readers because his theory of value did not remain as clean as some wanted it to be. Yet the very tension shows him working inside a changing society rather than forcing all conditions into a single formula. Rent brought land into the structure. The landlord did not usually labor in the direct production of grain, yet rent formed part of the price of agricultural goods. Land, once appropriated, gave its owner a claim on the produce of labor applied to it. Smith did not treat this claim as a timeless natural fact beyond examination. He explained its emergence historically and placed it within a society where property rights were enforced by law. Agriculture, manufacture, and trade all operated inside rules about who could own, exclude, lease, inherit, and collect. Profit added another claim. The owner of stock advanced materials, tools, wages, or goods before receiving returns. Profit compensated risk, waiting, and the use of capital. Though Smith often watched profit with suspicion because its owners had reasons to seek monopoly and restriction, the interests of workers, landlords, and capital owners were not always the same. A policy good for one group could burden another. Political economy, in Smith's hands, became a way of asking whose advantage had been mistaken for the prosperity of the whole. The division of labor depended on the extent of the market. This was one of Smith's most important insights. Specialization could grow only where exchange was wide enough to support it. A village with few buyers could not sustain the same variety of trades as a large town, and a large town could not support what a national or international market might allow. Roads, rivers, ports, security, and lawful exchange widened the market, and the widened market deepened specialization. The growth of productivity was therefore tied not only to individual skill, but to geography, infrastructure, trust, and political order. Transport mattered for that reason. Water carriage often made trade cheaper and more extensive than land carriage, especially before modern roads and railways transformed movement. Smith understood that a coastal or river-connected place could develop markets more easily than an inland place cut off by poor roads. This was not a decorative geographic observation. It belonged to the mechanics of wealth. Goods had to move at a cost people could bear, or the division of labor remained limited by distance. Money entered as an instrument that simplified exchange. Without it, barter required a double coincidence of wants: the awkward condition in which each person had to possess exactly what the other desired at the same time. Money allowed exchange to become more flexible. Smith was interested in money, but he did not confuse it with wealth itself. Gold and silver could assist circulation, measure value, and store purchasing power. Yet, a nation's real wealth lay in the goods and services its labor could command. This was one of his sharpest departures from mercantilist habits of thought. Such arguments may sound technical, but in Smith's book they carried a moral undertone. If wealth came from labor organized through society, then policy should not be designed only to enrich those nearest to power. If wages mattered to national flourishing, then the condition of the poor could not be dismissed as a private inconvenience. If merchants often sought monopoly, then legislators needed suspicion as well as admiration. If prices moved through supply, demand, and institutional arrangement, then bad laws could make ordinary life harder while claiming to protect the nation. Smith did not imagine that all inequality would vanish under commercial freedom. He accepted hierarchy more readily than many later critics could accept, and his world still carried assumptions of rank, gender, empire, and class that belonged to the 18th century. Yet within those limits, he repeatedly widened the field of concern. The laborer appeared not as background, but as a measure of social health. The consumer appeared against the producer who wanted protection. The public appeared against the merchants who wanted privilege. The poor appeared against the glittering admiration given to the rich. One reason Smith endures is that his work does not let any group rest comfortably for long. Advocates of markets find in him a powerful account of exchange, specialization, and natural liberty. Critics of business power find in him warnings against merchants, monopoly, and collusion. Reformers find concern for laboring people and public education. Skeptics of government find attacks on clumsy regulation and protection. Defenders of public institutions find his insistence on justice, infrastructure, defense, and instruction. His thought is not balanced in the shallow sense of saying every side is equally right. It is layered because the society he studied was layered. The price of bread, the wage of the worker, and the productivity of labor kept the layers connected. A law about trade could affect the merchant's profit, the farmer's return, the worker's wage, the consumer's table, and the government's revenue. Smith's genius lay partly in following these connections, without treating society as a simple machine. People pursued their own interests, but they did so through institutions they inherited, laws they obeyed or evaded, and moral judgments they could not entirely escape. Economic life was never sealed away from social life. That is why the pin factory should not be remembered only as a celebration of efficiency. It is also a doorway into Smith's larger method. Begin with a small object. Ask how it is made. Follow the labor behind it. Notice the tools, the market, the wages, the capital, the price, the buyers, the roads, the laws, and the habits of cooperation that make it ordinary. What looks simple becomes social. What looks private becomes institutional. A pin in the hand becomes a map of a commercial civilization. By the end of this part of Smith's argument, wealth had changed its meaning. It was no longer treasure locked away, nor the splendor of elites, nor the narrow gain of a trading interest protected by law. It was the productive power of labor under conditions that allowed skill, exchange, security, and improvement to grow. Yet that growth carried dangers of its own, because the same society that multiplied goods could narrow workers, empower merchants, justify inequality, and tempt governments into serving organized interests. Smith's next great movement was therefore not away from markets, but into the question of who bent markets, who protected privilege, and how the state could be captured by the very people claiming to enrich it. Chapter 10: Merchants, Monopolies, and the State. Merchants occupy one of the most misunderstood places in Adam Smith's thought. A later world often made him sound like their patron saint, the philosopher who gave commercial ambition its cleanest blessing. Smith's own pages are more troublesome than that. He understood the usefulness of merchants and manufacturers because they moved goods, extended markets, advanced capital, and connected one place to another through exchange. Yet few groups in the wealth of nations receive more sustained suspicion than merchants when they approach government with advice about policy. His concern was not that merchants were unusually wicked, it was that their position gave them a strong interest in confusing their own advantage with the advantage of the public. The merchant wanted access to large markets when selling his goods, but protection from rivals when buying, producing, or defending his place. The manufacturer praised freedom when it opened foreign demand, then asked for restriction when foreign goods competed at home. Such behavior did not require personal malice. It followed naturally from the pressure of interest, and Smith thought legislators were foolish when they treated interested advice as if it were neutral wisdom. Mercantilism gave that private interest a national language. For generations, European policy had been shaped by the belief that nations grew rich through favorable balances of trade, precious metals, protected industries, colonial monopolies, navigation laws, bounties, tariffs, and carefully managed commercial rivalry. The state watched imports and exports as if wealth were a contest of accumulation against neighbors. Smith believed this system had trained people to mistake the success of particular trades for the prosperity of the whole society. It made national policy look like public prudence, while often serving those organized enough to influence it. Tariffs were one instrument of that confusion. A tariff could raise the price of foreign goods and protect domestic producers from competition. To the protected manufacturer, the benefit was visible and concentrated. To consumers, the cost was spread through higher prices, often quietly enough that no single household saw the whole burden. Smith's sympathy in such cases leaned toward the consumer, a figure often forgotten in policy arguments dominated by producers. Consumption, he wrote, was the sole end and purpose of production, and the interest of the producer ought to be attended to only so far as it served the consumer. That sentence cut against much of the policy world around him. Producers could meet, petition, lobby, and present their difficulties in dignified language. Consumers were too scattered to act with the same force. A tax on imports, a restriction on competition, a bounty to encourage one trade, or a monopoly granted to one company might be defended as national improvement. Smith asked who paid, who benefited, and whether the public had been taught to admire a policy because its beneficiaries spoke loudly enough to name their private gain as patriotic necessity. Bounties troubled him for similar reasons. If the government paid to encourage the export or production of certain goods, it used public revenue to support a trade that might not stand on its own. The defenders of such policies could speak of employment, national strength, and commercial rivalry. Smith did not dismiss every transition problem or every practical difficulty, but he distrusted the habit of forcing the public to support what private interest wanted to make profitable. A trade that required continual public assistance might be less a source of wealth than a claim upon wealth produced elsewhere. Chartered companies displayed the problem in a larger and more durable form. A charter could give a company exclusive rights to trade in a region, excluding competitors by law rather than by skill, thrift, or superior service. The company then stood partly inside commerce and partly inside government, using legal privilege as an economic asset. Smith saw how dangerous this could become. Competition disciplined merchants by forcing them to satisfy buyers and control costs. Monopoly removed that discipline, allowing neglect, high prices, and political influence to take the place of improvement. The East India Company was the most powerful example in Smith's world. It was not merely a trading corporation moving textiles, tea, spices, and revenue through distant ports. It had become a territorial power in India, collecting revenue, commanding armies, negotiating with rulers, and exercising authority over millions of people. Commerce and sovereignty had become entangled in one body. To Smith, this was a warning written on an imperial scale. A company formed to pursue profit was badly fitted to govern a country, because its officers and proprietors had interests too narrow for the public responsibilities they had acquired. His criticism of the company was not a passing complaint. It belonged to a broader fear that monopoly corrupted both commerce and government. When a private corporation gained political power, it could use rule to secure profit rather than justice. When government granted exclusive privilege, it rewarded influence instead of service. When distant subjects were governed by men whose fortunes depended on extraction, the result could be disorder, misrule, and public scandal. Smith did not need modern corporate language to see the danger. He saw that a merchant with power over law was no longer merely a merchant. Britain had already been forced to confront the consequences of the company's position. The Bengal famine of the early 1770s, company financial crises, parliamentary interventions, and public controversy made the East India question impossible to ignore. Smith did not write with the full later vocabulary of colonial exploitation, but he understood that commercial empire could produce enormous suffering and administrative failure when profit was joined to authority. A state that outsourced power to a company did not escape responsibility. It merely made responsibility harder to see and easier to evade. Monopoly also harmed the public at home. Protected companies and favored trades could charge more, offer less, and resist innovation. Their defenders often claimed that exclusive rights were necessary to bear the risks of distant trade, especially where voyages were long and information uncertain. Smith acknowledged that some early ventures might have required unusual arrangements, but he thought monopolies survived long after their justification had passed. Privilege, once granted, rarely retired willingly. It learned to speak the language of national interest, because that language protected it better than plain self-defense could. The political influence of merchants made this worse. Smith famously warned that any proposal for a new law or regulation from merchants or manufacturers should be listened to with great precaution. They understood their own interest, and they often had superior knowledge of their trade, but that knowledge did not make them guardians of the public good. A legislator needed their information while resisting their conclusions. The difficulty lay in separating fact from interested interpretation, a task made harder when the men presenting the case were wealthy, organized, and socially respected. Smith's view of the state followed from this suspicion. He was not calling for a government too weak to act. He wanted a government strong enough to administer justice, defend the society, maintain public works, support certain institutions, and resist capture by organized interests. A weak state could become the servant of monopolists as easily as a heavy-handed one. The real question was not size in the abstract, but purpose and structure. Was law serving general prosperity, or had it become an instrument by which one class collected advantage from the rest? Navigation laws offered a case where Smith's judgment became more complicated. He criticized many restraints on trade, yet he treated Britain's navigation acts with a degree of allowance because they were tied to national defense and maritime power. Defense, in his account, was of more importance than opulence. This point matters because it shows that Smith's commitment to commercial liberty was not a mechanical rule applied without context. He could accept that security sometimes required economic cost. What he resisted was the disguising of private commercial advantage as public necessity when no genuine public necessity existed. Colonial trade forced these tensions together. Britain's colonies were bound by rules that directed commerce toward the mother country and restricted trade with others. Merchants connected to imperial markets benefited from preference, while consumers and colonists bore many of the costs. The system was defended as a source of national wealth, but Smith examined whether the public truly gained once military expense, administrative burden, debt, and conflict were counted. Empire often created the appearance of commercial greatness while quietly transferring costs to taxpayers and consumers. In this sense, Smith's argument was not anti-commercial. It was anti-delusion. He believed commerce could extend cooperation, increase productivity, lower prices, widen choice, and improve the condition of ordinary people. But commerce did those things best when competition remained open and when law did not bend itself around privileged groups. The merchant who risked capital in open competition belonged to a different moral and political category from the merchant who secured profit through restriction. Smith's defense of markets depended on that distinction. The social world of merchants also interested him because people of the same trade had reason to gather and conspire, even when the gathering looked innocent. He observed that meetings of people in the same business often ended in some contrivance to raise prices. The line has been remembered because it punctures the polite surface of commercial respectability. Smith did not need to imagine a villainous merchant class. He only needed to notice that shared interest encourages coordination, and coordination among sellers can burden buyers when law and competition fail to restrain it. Guilds and local regulations provided smaller versions of the same pattern. Apprenticeship rules, exclusive rights to practice a trade, municipal privileges, and corporate restrictions could all be defended as protections of quality or order. Sometimes they had real administrative purposes. Often they limited entry, kept prices higher, and protected established producers against newcomers. Smith's criticism of such arrangements came from his belief that labor, capital, and enterprise should not be confined by inherited barriers that served insiders more than society. Laborers did not possess the same power of organized influence. When workers combined to raise wages, law and public opinion often treated them harshly. When masters combined to keep wages down, the combination could be quieter, more respectable, and more difficult to challenge. Smith noticed this imbalance. His defense of market freedom did not blind him to the fact that the wealthy could organize under the cover of ordinary business, while the poor were more easily accused of disorder. The law itself could carry the assumptions of rank into the supposedly neutral field of exchange. This is why Smith's political economy cannot be reduced to the phrase laissez-faire, especially in the later ideological sense. He wanted many restrictions removed because they protected privilege, raised prices, distorted labor, and encouraged bad investment. But his removal of restriction was not a blessing on every powerful private actor. It was often an attempt to take privilege away from those actors. Natural liberty, for Smith, meant a system in which individuals could pursue their own interest under equal laws, restrained by justice, competition, and the public duties of the state. It did not mean that the strongest commercial groups should write the rules. His tone made the critique more effective. Smith did not attack merchants with revolutionary fury. He described their incentives, their habits, and their political influence with dry steadiness. That steadiness allowed the criticism to pass into serious policy discussion. He sounded less like an enemy of commerce than like a physician describing a recurring disease in commercial society. The disease was not trade itself. It was the fever of monopoly, the swelling of privilege, and the willingness of statesmen to mistake the patient's loudest voice for the health of the whole body. The body metaphor was not Smith's usual method in the book, but the diagnosis was clear enough. Commercial society needed law, competition, and trust. It needed merchants, but it could not safely be governed by them. It needed manufacturers, but it should not allow them to tax the public through protection. It needed companies to organize capital, but not companies so privileged that they became little sovereigns. It needed government, but a government alert to the difference between public good and private pressure. The difficulty was that all these needs had to be held together inside actual politics, where influence rarely distributed itself evenly. By the end of Smith's critique, the market looked less like a natural wilderness and more like a cultivated field whose rules mattered at every boundary. Remove the wrong restraints and activity could grow. Grant the wrong privileges and the field could be fenced for the benefit of a few. Leave power unexamined and liberty itself could become the word by which stronger interests defended their advantage. Smith's next position in life would make the matter even more concrete, because the philosopher of trade would become an officer of customs, serving inside the revenue system of the state whose policies he had so carefully examined. Chapter 11. Empire seen from a customs desk. Adam Smith entered public office after he had already written one of the great criticisms of commercial policy. In 1778, 2 years after The Wealth of Nations appeared, he became a Commissioner of Customs in Scotland, a post that placed him inside the revenue machinery of the British state. The appointment can look, at first glance, like an irony too neat to be trusted. A man who had written against many restraints on trade now helped administer duties, inspections, seizures, and regulations. Yet the contradiction softens when placed in its own century. Smith had never argued that commerce could exist without law, and he had never imagined that a modern state could run without revenue. The customs service belonged to the practical underside of empire. Ships did not merely arrive with goods, they arrived into systems of classification, paperwork, rates, exemptions, prohibited items, bonded warehouses, port officers, informers, legal disputes, and opportunities for evasion. Tea, tobacco, wine, spirits, linen, sugar, and countless other goods became part of the state's fiscal life once they crossed a boundary. A port was therefore not only a place of exchange, it was a place where the government touched commerce directly, measuring it, taxing it, and trying to keep private profit from escaping public claim. Smith's office in Edinburgh gave his later life a regularity different from the long compositional years in Kirkcaldy. He had duties to perform, meetings to attend, reports to consider, and administrative decisions to support. The work was not glamorous, and it did not resemble the grand image of a philosopher shaping nations from a study. It belonged to desks, documents, signatures, inspections, and the steady attention required by public employment. A thinker who had written about revenue now lived among the paper by which revenue was collected. Customs administration also placed Smith near the problem of smuggling. High duties created temptation, and in the 18th century, smuggling was not an exotic edge of commerce. It could be a large and organized practice, especially where taxes made legal goods dear and coastlines gave illicit trade many small openings. Scotland, with its long shores and local networks, was part of that world. People who might appear respectable in one setting could be connected to illegal importation in another. The line between ordinary trade and evasion could become a practical contest between officers and merchants, law and profit, public revenue and private advantage. Smith understood the roots of such evasion better than many officials. In The Wealth of Nations, he had argued that taxes should be certain, convenient, proportionate, and economical to collect. A badly designed tax did not merely burden the people who paid it, it encouraged avoidance, raised the cost of enforcement, and trained citizens to treat government as an adversary. Customs duties were especially vulnerable to this problem because they were collected at points where goods moved and where concealment could be profitable. The Customs Commissioner therefore saw, in daily form, one of the basic truths of his political economy: policy-shaped conduct. The American War gave these questions a heavier background. Britain's conflict with its colonies had grown from disputes over authority, taxation, representation, and imperial control, and the war placed enormous pressure on public finance. Revenue was not an abstract need. Armies, navies, debts, supplies, and administration required money. Smith had criticized the imperial system that helped produce the crisis, but once the crisis existed, the state's fiscal demands continued. A government fighting war could not sustain itself through philosophical clarity alone. It needed collections, loans, and offices where the machinery of revenue kept moving. This was one of the sober facts that separated Smith from simpler later images of him. He did not believe that states became unnecessary when markets became free. He believed states had essential duties: defense, justice, certain public works, and certain institutions that private interest would not adequately provide. Revenue belonged to those duties because without money the state could not perform them. His criticism was aimed less at the existence of taxation than at taxes that were arbitrary, unequal, obscure, expensive, or shaped by privilege. The customs desk was therefore not outside his thought. It was one of the places where his thought met its hardest practical form. Lord North's government struggled to hold together war, finance, and political authority during the years of Smith's customs service. The American colonies had become more than a commercial problem. They had become a test of imperial imagination. Smith had suggested in his book that Britain needed to think realistically about the cost and purpose of empire, even considering forms of union or separation that most statesmen were not ready to accept. Events moved beyond theory. The colonies fought. France entered the war, and the British state faced the consequences of an imperial system whose burdens Smith had already tried to measure. From Edinburgh, Smith did not become a revolutionary voice. He remained a public officer, a scholar, and a man of measured public conduct. His temperament was not that of a pamphleteer rushing into every controversy. The customs post gave him income, status, and official responsibility. It also required a certain discipline of silence. A commissioner could not behave like an outsider attacking policy at will. Public office brought him inside the structure he had analyzed, and that position narrowed the kinds of public speech available to him. Still, the office did not erase the critic. It gave his criticism additional texture. He had written that commerce was shaped by law, and now he served within one of the legal structures that shaped it. He had warned that high duties could encourage smuggling, and now he belonged to the service that confronted smuggling. He had argued that taxes should be clear and convenient, and now he worked in a system where clarity and convenience were often difficult to achieve. The philosopher did not leave the administrator behind. The administrator carried the philosopher into rooms of ledgers and reports. The customs service also connected Smith to the imperial goods, whose moral and political meanings were often hidden by their place in ordinary consumption. Tea on a table, sugar in a cup, tobacco in a pipe, and cloth in a shop could all be linked to distant labor, colonial policy, shipping networks, duties, and monopoly privileges. The consumer encountered a product. The customs officer encountered a taxable object. The political economist tried to see the chain that joined the two. Smith's later official life placed him near that chain at the point where the state marked it with numbers. Edinburgh itself offered a suitable setting for this final public phase. The city was no longer merely the place where Smith had once lectured as an ambitious younger man. It had become one of the intellectual capitals of Europe, home to lawyers, physicians, professors, historians, scientists, publishers, and clubs where serious conversation could continue late into the evening. Smith's official duties did not remove him from that society. They placed him within it as an established figure, respected for 2 major books and surrounded by men who understood that Scotland had become unusually influential in the Republic of Letters. Joseph Black, the chemist, and James Hutton, the geologist, belonged to the same broad circle of inquiry. Their subjects differed from Smith's, yet their habits shared something with his: attention to process, hidden order, gradual change, and the movement from observed particulars toward general explanation. Hutton looked at the earth and saw depths of time that unsettled ordinary chronology. Black examined heat and air with experimental care. Smith studied moral judgment, law, labor, trade, and revenue. Together, such figures made late 8th century Edinburgh feel like a city where explanation itself had become a civic art. Smith's friendship with David Hume had already reached its final chapter by the time the customs appointment began. Hume died in 1776, the year The Wealth of Nations appeared, leaving Smith with the task of responding to his friend's last days and reputation. Smith's account of Hume's calm death drew criticism from religious readers who disliked the image of a skeptic meeting death without visible terror. The episode mattered because it showed Smith's loyalty, restraint, and willingness to honor a friend even when public piety might have advised caution. It also showed the moral world in which he lived: friendship, reputation, belief, and public judgment still pressing around the philosopher of markets. Public judgment mattered intensely in the 18th century. A man's character was not simply private property. It circulated through letters, anecdotes, published remarks, club conversation, and the memory of those who had dined or worked with him. Smith himself had become a figure of anecdote: absent-minded, benevolent, sometimes awkward, often absorbed. Stories gathered around him because fame invites small details to become signs. A man lost in thought becomes, after reputation hardens, the very image of philosophy walking through ordinary life without quite noticing it. Yet Smith's later years were not detached from practical affairs. As Commissioner of Customs, he received a substantial salary and occupied a post of public trust. He was not wealthy in the manner of aristocrats or great merchants, but he was comfortable. His finances allowed him to support a household and maintain the social obligations expected of his position. The scholarship boy from Kirkcaldy had become a senior public official in Edinburgh, with a life shaped by books and office rather than by inherited estate. The relation between his office and his ideas continued to carry a gentle tension. Customs duties were a form of restriction on trade, but they were also a major source of revenue. Smith had not demanded that all such duties vanish. He preferred taxes that were less disruptive, but he accepted that states had to collect money where collection was practical. The question was always comparative: which taxes burdened least, which encouraged least fraud, which fell most fairly, which could be known in advance, which consumed the smallest share of what they brought in. These were not questions for dreamers, they belonged to administrators. The customs desk also clarified the distance between natural liberty as a principle and government as a daily craft. A principle could guide judgment, but administration required forms, officers, procedures, and compromises. Smith's thought has sometimes been made to sound as if he wanted government merely to step aside and let private action unfold. His life suggests a different picture. He wanted law to stop granting unjust privilege, but he expected law to remain present. He wanted commerce to breathe, but he knew that defense, justice, roads, education, and revenue would not appear by wishing the state away. In the background, Britain was changing. The loss of the American colonies forced imperial reflection, though not always the kind Smith would have preferred. India remained under the shadow of the East India Company and parliamentary intervention. Industrial changes, still uneven and regionally varied, were beginning to alter production in ways that would later make Smith seem prophetic. Though he did not see the full factory age that followed, public debt remained a heavy concern. Commercial society kept widening, and the questions raised in the wealth of nations became more rather than less urgent. Smith revised his works during these years, including later editions of the Theory of Moral Sentiments. That fact matters because it shows that he did not seal his moral philosophy away after writing about wealth. He returned to it, adjusted it, and remained concerned with the moral life of social beings until near the end. The public remembered him increasingly for political economy, but Smith himself still treated moral sentiments as part of the same intellectual world. The customs commissioner was still the philosopher of sympathy, self-command, and the impartial spectator. As an official, Smith saw the state from within. As a philosopher, he had already described the temptations of statesmen who imagined society could be arranged according to their own elegant plans. The two perspectives restrained each other. He knew policy could harm when captured by private interests or designed with arrogant simplicity. He also knew that administration could not be replaced by slogans about liberty. Goods arrived, duties had to be assessed, smugglers had to be pursued, public accounts had to be kept. Government existed not only in theory, but in rooms where clerks handled paper and officers waited for ships. The experience did not produce another great book. Smith's two major works already contained the central architecture of his thought, and his later years were spent more in revision, conversation, office, and social life than in the creation of a new system. Yet the absence of a third great work should not make the period seem empty. It was the time in which his earlier ideas settled into public reputation, while he lived inside the practical state, whose duties and dangers he had described. Toward the end of this phase, Smith's life began to narrow into Edinburgh, friendship, memory, and preparation. He had outlived Hume, left Glasgow long behind, completed the work that made him famous, and taken his place among the senior men of Scotland's Enlightenment. His name had begun travelling farther than his body ever would. The customs office had shown one more face of the world he studied: commerce measured by law, empire counted in duties, and public finance resting on the daily routines of administration. The final years would bring him back to manuscripts, revisions, old attachments, and the question of what a careful thinker chooses to leave behind. Chapter 12: The Invisible Hand and Its Many Shadows. The Adam Smith most people inherit is often smaller than the Adam Smith who wrote. He is reduced to a hand, a market, a phrase, and a confidence that private interest will arrange public benefit if only no one interferes. That version is easy to quote because it is clean. It can be carried into speeches, editorials, classrooms, and arguments without much of the surrounding difficulty. The trouble is that Smith's actual work was never that clean, and the famous phrase later attached to him appears only rarely in the writings he left behind. The phrase invisible hand occurs once in the Theory of Moral Sentiments and once in The Wealth of Nations, with another use in an earlier essay on astronomy. That scarcity does not make it unimportant, but it does make its later fame historically strange. Smith did not build a system around the phrase. He did not place it at the center of a doctrine called capitalism. He did not announce it as a law by which every market outcome became wise. The phrase became powerful after him because later readers needed a compact symbol for something larger than the original wording had been asked to carry. In the Theory of Moral Sentiments, the phrase appears in a passage about the rich, whose desire for grandeur leads them to employ labor and distribute the produce of the earth in ways that support others beyond themselves. Smith's point was not that the rich were morally admirable because hidden order made them generous. He had just described their pursuit of luxury with irony and moral distance. The invisible hand in that context named an unintended distribution, not a sanctification of vanity. Human beings chase splendor, mistake wealth for happiness, and still, through the structure of social dependence, cause bread to reach people whom they did not intend to benefit. In The Wealth of Nations, the phrase appears in a different setting. Smith discusses a merchant who prefers to invest domestically rather than abroad because he feels safer keeping capital near home. By pursuing his own security and gain, the merchant may support domestic industry more effectively than if he had set out deliberately to serve the public. Again, the idea concerns unintended consequence. A private motive can produce a public result without public benevolence being the motive. Yet this was never an unlimited rule. The same book contains hundreds of pages warning that private interests often distort policy, seek monopoly, mislead legislators, burden consumers, and damage the public good. That contrast is the center of the matter. Smith believed that unintended order could arise from self-interested action, but he also believed that self-interested action could corrupt law. The difference depended on institutions, competition, justice, information, and the absence of special privilege. A baker selling bread, a merchant investing capital, and a monopolist lobbying parliament did not occupy the same moral and political position simply because each pursued interest. Smith's later simplifiers often kept the self-interest and lost the institutional discipline that made some forms of self-interest socially useful. The invisible hand became famous because it offered a beautiful compression. Modern economic life is too complex for any one person to direct in detail. Prices carry information, buyers and sellers adjust without central instruction. Goods appear in shops because countless people, each pursuing local purposes, form chains of cooperation no single mind designed. Smith did see this kind of order, and he described it with lasting force. But his broader work also asked what happens when the price is shaped by monopoly, when the law is written by merchants, when workers lack bargaining power, when empire hides its cost, and when admiration for wealth makes societies morally foolish. A phrase can become more portable by losing its weight. The invisible hand traveled well because it allowed later generations to speak about markets with almost theological elegance, without always pausing over Smith's doubts. It turned complicated social analysis into a symbol of harmony. In political speech, that symbol could be used to argue against regulation, against planning, against public ownership, against taxation, or against almost any interference in private exchange. Some of those arguments had Smithian roots. Others rested on a Smith stripped of his warnings. 19th-century readers found in Smith a powerful ally for free trade. Britain's debates over the Corn Laws, tariffs, and commercial restriction gave his work renewed public life. The Corn Laws protected domestic grain producers and raised fierce arguments about bread, land, industry, and the cost of living. Free traders could look back to Smith as a thinker who had exposed the errors of mercantilism and the burdens of protection. In that setting, Smith's critique of monopoly and restraint served a real political purpose. His name helped give historical authority to the idea that trade should not be organized for the benefit of protected interests. Yet even in the 19th century, Smith could not be confined to one use. Industrial Britain had produced factories, urban poverty, labor conflict, and new forms of wealth far beyond the scale he had known. Readers who cared about workers could find in him concern for wages, education, bargaining imbalance, and the condition of the poor. Readers who cared about capital could find an account of accumulation and productive investment. Readers who cared about state finance could find principles of taxation and warnings about debt. The book's breadth made Smith available to more than one political inheritance. Karl Marx read Smith seriously, and that fact alone should disturb the simplest modern categories. Marx criticized classical political economy, but he also learned from it. Smith's account of labor, value, class interests, accumulation, and historical development belonged to the intellectual world Marx inherited and transformed. The distance between them was vast in purpose and conclusion, yet Marx did not treat Smith as a fool. He treated him as one of the major thinkers through whom bourgeois society had begun to understand itself. Smith's afterlife, therefore, passed not only through defenders of markets, but through some of their most searching critics. Alfred Marshall and later economists inherited another Smith, the ancestor of a discipline becoming more technical, mathematical, and professional. Political economy slowly turned toward economics, and the older mixture of moral philosophy, history, jurisprudence, and policy analysis was divided into specialized fields. Smith remained a founder, but founders are often simplified by the disciplines that claim them. What had been broad inquiry became a prehistory to technical method. His name stayed at the gate, while many parts of his intellectual world were left outside. 20th-century market liberals recovered Smith with new urgency. Friedrich Hayek admired the idea of order arising without central design, and in that respect he belonged to one of the strongest lines of Smith's inheritance. Hayek's critique of central planning rested on the difficulty of gathering and using dispersed knowledge, a problem Smith would have understood in 18th-century language. Milton Friedman and others later invoked Smith as part of the case for market freedom against state control. In the 20th century, especially during struggles over socialism, planning, welfare states, inflation, and regulation, Smith became not only a historical author, but a banner. A banner is not the same as a book. The Smith carried into ideological battle was often sharper, cleaner, and more obedient than the Smith on the page. His suspicion of government was remembered. His suspicion of merchants was less convenient. His defense of natural liberty was remembered. His support for public works, education, justice, defense, and taxation was softened. His account of self-interest was remembered. His moral psychology of sympathy, vanity, propriety, and impartial judgment was treated as a separate matter, as though it belonged to another man. Amartya Sen, among later readers, helped draw attention back to the moral Smith. Sen argued against the narrow view that Smith saw human beings as driven only by self-interest. In Smith's actual writings, people seek approval, feel sympathy, follow rules, care about justice, and act within moral sentiments that cannot be reduced to profit. This recovery matters because it returns Smith to the 18th-century moral world from which he came. The author of The Wealth of Nations was also the author who understood that people want to be loved and to be lovely, to be praised and to deserve praise. The phrase capitalism itself complicates Smith's legacy. Smith did not use the term in the modern ideological sense, and he did not write after the full development of industrial capitalism. He saw commercial society, manufacturing, colonial trade, agricultural improvement, banking, public debt, and early industrial change, but he did not see railways, global corporations, mass factory systems, digital finance, or multinational supply chains. Calling him the father of capitalism can be useful shorthand, but it can also make him responsible for a world that came after him and made choices he did not make. What Smith did offer was a way of asking how wealth is produced, how labor becomes more productive, how exchange widens cooperation, how laws shape incentives, and how private interests may either serve or injure public prosperity. Those questions remain alive because modern markets still contain the tensions he saw. Competition can lower prices, but firms may seek monopoly. Trade can widen abundance, but political power can arrange who gains. Labor can become productive, but workers can be narrowed by repetitive tasks or weakened in bargaining. Governments can correct abuses, but they can also be captured by the very interests they are meant to regulate. The invisible hand, when returned to this larger setting, becomes less like a magical guarantee and more like one part of a difficult theory of social order. Smith noticed that people often contribute to outcomes they did not intend. That insight remains powerful. But unintended outcomes can be beneficial, harmful, or mixed. A market may coordinate knowledge without central command. A monopoly may coordinate influence against the public. A colonial system may enrich some citizens while burdening taxpayers and subject peoples. Public debt may fund defense while hiding the cost of war. Smith's greatness lies not in pretending that all spontaneous orders are good, but in teaching readers to ask how they arise and whom they serve. Modern financial markets have made his ghost larger than his text. Stocks move in seconds, currencies respond to rumors, supply chains join continents, prices change on screens before goods have moved at all. Governments still argue over tariffs, subsidies, taxes, debt, regulation, trade agreements, and corporate power. In almost every one of these arguments, some fragment of Smith can be summoned. His name appears when someone defends competition, when someone warns against protection, when someone praises self-interest, when someone attacks monopoly, when someone asks whether wealth has reached ordinary people. This is why Smith still haunts markets, though not as the ghostly figure of the title might suggest. He haunts them as an unresolved thinker, one whose sentences are still useful because the problems have not disappeared. The modern world has enlarged the scale, accelerated the machinery, and changed the instruments, but it has not escaped the old questions. Who benefits when policy is written? What happens when private interest wears the language of public good? How much can order arise without design? Where does liberty end and privilege begin? What does a rich society owe to the people whose labor sustains it? The simplified Smith will probably never vanish. He is too convenient. A short phrase will always travel farther than a long book, and the invisible hand will always be easier to remember than the patient arguments surrounding it. Yet the fuller Smith remains available, waiting in the pages that made him more than a slogan. He was not an enemy of markets, and he was not their priest. He was a moral philosopher of commercial society, attentive to the promise of exchange and the dangers of power gathering around it. By the later years of his life, Smith had already begun to see his own reputation change. The wealth of nations had entered public argument, while the theory of moral sentiments continued to matter to him enough to revise. The two books belonged together, though later memory often pulled them apart. His final years in Edinburgh would show a man guarding his unfinished papers, revisiting his moral philosophy, and living among friends who understood that his fame had begun to move beyond the quiet habits of the person who bore it. Chapter 13. The Last Years in Edinburgh. Edinburgh held Adam Smith's final years with a mixture of public duty, intellectual friendship, and gradual withdrawal. He had returned to the city not as the young lecturer who once needed reputation, but as one of Scotland's most respected men of letters, the author of 2 major works and a commissioner in the customs service. His life had narrowed geographically after the long movements of youth and middle age, yet the world around his name had begun to widen. Books could travel where bodies did not, and by the 1780s, Smith's arguments were already moving through circles of government, scholarship, and reform far beyond Scotland. His work as Commissioner of Customs gave structure to these years. The post brought income, standing, and regular responsibility. It also placed him among the practical documents of trade, duties assessed, goods classified, evasions pursued, and revenue protected for the state. Such work did not have the outward brilliance of authorship, but it suited part of Smith's mind. He had long cared about institutions not as ornaments of theory, but as arrangements that shaped conduct. A customs office was one of those arrangements made visible in paper, procedure, and habit. The city around him had become a remarkable gathering place. Edinburgh's Enlightenment was not a single school with one doctrine, but a society of overlapping conversations. Lawyers, doctors, professors, historians, chemists, geologists, ministers, publishers, and civil servants moved through its houses, clubs, university rooms, and dining tables. Smith belonged to this world as an elder figure, respected without being theatrical. His fame did not turn him into a performer. Those who knew him remembered odd manners, kindness, abstraction, and conversation that could become rich once his thought had settled on its subject. David Hume's absence remained one of the defining losses of Smith's later life. Hume had died in 1776, the same year The Wealth of Nations appeared, and Smith's public letter about his friend's final composure created controversy among religious critics. The letter presented Hume as calm, cheerful, and morally admirable at the edge of death, despite Hume's reputation for skepticism. This was not a small act of friendship. In a culture where religious judgment still shaped public reputation, Smith chose to preserve the character of his friend as he had known it, rather than soften the account to satisfy the devout. That episode reveals something steady in Smith's character. He was cautious, but not cowardly. He avoided needless provocation, yet he could stand by a friend when doing so carried social cost. His temperament was often measured, his prose patient, his public manner guarded. But beneath that restraint lay firm attachments. Hume had been more than a celebrated mind nearby. He had been a companion in the long effort to understand human nature, history, commerce, belief, and social order without surrendering to easy formulas. Smith's household life also carried old attachments. Margaret Douglas, his mother, remained central until her death in 1784. She had lived long enough to see the fatherless child from Kirkcaldy become one of the best-known thinkers in Britain. Her presence had framed the beginning of his life, and then the long writing years in Kirkcaldy, when The Wealth of Nations slowly took form. The death of a parent so late in a son's life changes the shape of memory. For Smith, it removed the earliest witness to the life that had preceded reputation. His cousin Janet Douglas also belonged to the domestic world of his later years, helping manage the household that gave his public life its private order. Smith never married, and his home was not built around children or a direct family line of his own. Instead, it rested on kinship, servants, guests, books, duties, and friendships. In a life so often claimed by abstractions, these domestic facts are useful. They keep the philosopher inside rooms where meals had to be arranged, visitors received, letters answered, and ordinary care maintained. The later editions of his works show that Smith did not treat publication as a final release from thought. He revised The Wealth of Nations through successive editions, adjusting arguments, adding material, and responding to the changing world around him. He also returned with special seriousness to the theory of moral sentiments. The sixth edition, published in 1790, the year of his death, contained substantial revisions, including a new part on the character of virtue. That fact matters. At the end of his life, Smith was still thinking about moral character, not only commercial order. This late return to moral philosophy helps correct the fractured memory of him. Later readers often separate the two Smiths, the humane moral philosopher of sympathy and the stern economist of self-interest. Smith did not live inside that division. His final revisions suggest that the moral life remained unfinished business for him. The person who trades, bargains, saves, invests, consumes, envies, labors, and governs is still the person who seeks approval, fears blame, admires greatness, misjudges happiness, and tries to see himself from a steadier point of view. His health declined during these final years, though he continued to work and meet friends as he could. The body that had carried him from Kirkcaldy to Glasgow Oxford, France, Geneva, Paris, London, and Edinburgh was wearing down. Smith had never been remembered as physically strong. His old habits of abstraction remained, and anecdotes continued to gather around him. The scholar lost in thought, the man wandering in conversation, the philosopher whose inward life sometimes seemed to carry him beyond the immediate room. Such stories are difficult to separate from affectionate exaggeration, but they survived because they matched something people believed they had seen. Among his companions in Edinburgh were men whose own inquiries stretched the boundaries of knowledge. Joseph Black had changed chemical understanding through work on heat and gases. James Hutton had begun to reveal a geological time far older than ordinary chronology allowed. Dugald Stewart, younger than Smith, would become one of the key transmitters of his public memory. These men did not all study the same subject, yet they shared an intellectual atmosphere in which hidden processes mattered. Heat, stone, manners, markets, and moral judgment could all be approached as systems with histories. Smith's relation to fame remained restrained. He had become important, but he did not build a personal school in the modern sense. He did not create a movement with disciples repeating a formula under his name. His influence moved through books, teaching, conversation, and the adoption of his arguments by others. This gave his legacy a peculiar freedom and danger. Because he did not police it through an institution, later readers could take what they needed. They could carry away natural liberty, the invisible hand, labor, sympathy, taxation, free trade, or suspicion of merchants, sometimes without carrying the rest. The most revealing act of his final days concerned the papers he did not want to survive. Smith had long worked on projects beyond his 2 published books, including material connected to jurisprudence and the history of law and government. Near the end of his life, he instructed friends to destroy many of his manuscripts. Joseph Black and James Hutton are traditionally associated with carrying out this wish. The scene has often troubled admirers because it suggests a vanished Smith, unwritten or unfinished works that might have shown more of his system, more of his lectures, more of the bridge between moral philosophy, law, and political economy. The destruction should not be turned into melodrama. Smith was a careful author who did not want unfinished work to represent him. In an age before modern archives made a virtue of preserving every scrap, such a wish had its own dignity. He had labored over the books he chose to print. He revised them, ordered them, and sent them into the world under his name. What remained incomplete did not meet the standard by which he judged himself. The loss belongs to intellectual history, but the decision belongs to the man. Still, the missing manuscripts leave a real silence. Later readers know Smith partly through what survived by accident, especially student notes from his lectures on jurisprudence. These notes help reveal how much more he thought about law, government, property, punishment, and historical development than the 2 major books alone might suggest. The destroyed papers may have contained a fuller version of that work. Their absence makes Smith's surviving writings feel both monumental and incomplete, like large stones from a building whose full plan can still be guessed only in outline. His final illness drew friends near. Smith is said to have remarked that he believed they would have to resume their meeting in another place, a line remembered because it carries both wit and farewell without heavy display. As with many deathbed sayings, the exact tone is impossible to recover fully. What matters is the memory his friends preserved, a sociable mind remaining sociable near the end, a man whose life had been spent in conversation, leaving conversation as one of his last human forms. Adam Smith died in Edinburgh on July 17, 1790. He was 67 years old. The age does not seem great by later standards, but his life had covered an extraordinary span of 18th-century change. He had been born into post-Union Scotland, educated in its universities, formed by its Enlightenment, carried into French intellectual circles, returned to write one of the central books of political economy, and ended as a public official in the city where his early reputation had first begun. He was buried in Canongate Kirkyard, not far from the life of Edinburgh's Old Town. Burial places gather many kinds of memory: family grief, civic pride, literary pilgrimage, and the later curiosity of strangers, Smith's grave would become one of those physical points where a vast reputation narrows back into stone, inscription, weather, and the small geography of a churchyard. The man whose name would be attached to global markets ended in a local place, under the ordinary conditions that receive almost everyone. After his death, the work of memory began at once. Friends, students, readers, and later commentators had to decide what kind of man had been lost. Was he chiefly the moral philosopher of sympathy, the analyst of commercial society, the critic of mercantilism, the friend of Hume, the Scottish professor, the founder of political economy, the customs commissioner? The answer was never one thing. Smith's life had passed through too many rooms, books, duties, and conversations to be held by a single title. The final years in Edinburgh, therefore, do not close his story so much as prepare its transformation. In life, Smith had been careful, sociable, scholarly, and often guarded. In death, he became available. Others could quote him, simplify him, defend him, attack him, invoke him in Parliament, place him in textbooks, and make his name stand for things he had argued with more delicacy than they remembered. The manuscripts he burned were gone. The books he published remained. Around those surviving pages, the many later Smiths began to gather. Chapter 14. The Smith, the world inherited. Dugald Stewart helped give Adam Smith to the world after Smith himself could no longer answer for his own name. In 1793, 3 years after Smith's death, Stewart read his account of Smith's life and writings before the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and that memorial became one of the earliest important efforts to shape the public memory of the man. It presented Smith as part of Scotland's great intellectual achievement, a thinker formed by universities, friendship, moral inquiry, and patient study. The living man had been cautious, sometimes absent-minded, affectionate with friends, and exacting with his own work. The remembered man was already beginning to become larger, smoother, and more useful to posterity. Memory has its own economy. It selects, simplifies, circulates, and gives value to certain parts of a life while letting others fall into shadow. Smith's 2 published books made that process easier and harder at the same time. The Theory of Moral Sentiments offered the moral philosopher sympathy, propriety, self-command, the impartial spectator, the human hunger for approval, and the danger of admiring wealth too readily. The Wealth of Nations offered the political economist labor, markets, prices, trade, taxation, public debt, colonies, monopolies, and the long argument against mercantile restriction. Later readers often wanted one of these Smiths more than the other. The 19th century found immediate uses for him. Britain became a country of factories, canals, railways, growing cities, industrial wealth, urban poverty, and political reform. The world Smith had known was commercial and improving, but the full industrial age that followed his death moved with a force he had only partly seen. Machines multiplied production on a scale beyond the pin factory. Workers gathered in towns whose size and conditions would have startled many 18th century observers. Capital, labor, and law became public questions with new urgency. Smith's language remained available, but the world asking questions of him had changed. Free traders claimed him with particular confidence. In the long debates over tariffs, protection, grain prices, and the Corn Laws, Smith's attack on mercantilism and monopoly gave reformers an ancestral voice. The Corn Laws protected domestic grain producers, especially landowning interests, by restricting cheaper foreign grain. Their critics argued that such protection raised the price of bread and burdened the wider public for the benefit of a class already powerful in Parliament. Smith had died before this struggle reached its 19th century shape, yet his pages supplied a way to say that producer privilege should not be mistaken for national prosperity. That use of Smith was not false. He had criticized protection, warned against merchants and manufacturers advising legislators in their own interest, and insisted that consumption was the end of production. A law that made bread dearer in order to preserve landed advantage would have fitted many of his suspicions. Yet even a true inheritance can become partial. The free trade Smith was real, but he was not the whole man. The moral philosopher who worried about the poor, the observer who distrusted admiration for rank, and the public thinker who accepted important duties of government, could not be erased without changing the texture of his thought. Industrial capitalism also gave Smith readers who approached him from the opposite direction. Karl Marx read classical political economy with seriousness, and Smith stood among the writers Marx studied, criticized, and transformed. Marx did not treat him as a mere defender of greed. He recognized in Smith a major analyst of bourgeois society, labor, value, accumulation, and class interest, even while arguing that classical political economy could not fully understand the exploitative structure of capitalism. This is one of the stranger turns in Smith's afterlife. The man often invoked as capitalism's father became part of the intellectual ancestry of capitalism's most famous critic. Marx's reading shows how wide Smith's work had become. A narrow apologist for merchants would not have interested him in the same way. Smith's attention to labor, productivity, wages, profit, rent, and historical development gave later critics material to work with. His categories did not lead to Marx's conclusions, but they helped form the ground on which later arguments stood. The difference between them should not be softened into agreement. It is enough to notice that Smith's work was serious enough to be inherited by adversaries. Academic economics made another Smith. As the 19th century moved into the 20th, political economy became more specialized. Alfred Marshall and others helped shape economics into a more formal discipline, increasingly concerned with marginal analysis, equilibrium, supply and demand, and technical explanation. Smith remained near the beginning of the story, a founder whose work could be honored before the discipline moved into methods he did not possess. Such founding positions are flattering and dangerous. They place a name at the entrance, while leaving much of the original house unvisited. The older breadth of Smith's inquiry did not fit easily inside the newer discipline. He had written history, moral psychology, jurisprudence, public finance, institutional criticism, and economic analysis together. Later academic divisions placed these subjects in separate rooms. Economists could claim his market insights, while moral philosophers kept his sympathy. Historians took his account of social stages, political theorists read his statecraft, and legal scholars noticed his concern with justice. The division made study easier, but it also broke the unity of a mind that had not separated society into modern departments. In the 20th century, Smith became a central figure in arguments over planning and markets. Friedrich Hayek found in him a predecessor for the idea that social order may arise without central design. The insight was genuinely Smithian. Smith had shown how individuals pursuing their own purposes could produce patterns no one had intended, especially when law and competition allowed exchange to work without monopoly or privilege. Hayek's world, however, contained socialist planning, modern bureaucracy, mass democracy, and industrial complexity on a scale Smith never knew. The inheritance was real, but it passed through a new century's fears. Milton Friedman and other market liberals carried Smith into public argument with even greater visibility. In debates over government regulation, inflation, welfare, taxation, and economic freedom, Smith's name became a symbol of market confidence. The invisible hand, already detached from its narrow textual settings, became a kind of shorthand for the intelligence of voluntary exchange. This version of Smith spoke powerfully to people who believed that governments often made economic life worse by trying to improve it. It also encouraged a habit of reading Smith as though his main task had been to bless private markets against public interference. The difficulty is that Smith's own warnings point in more than one direction. He warned against clumsy government, but also against monopolists. He criticized regulation, but also expected the state to provide justice, defense, public works, and education. He admired the productivity of commercial society, but feared the mental narrowing caused by extreme division of labor. He believed people could unintentionally promote the public good, but he also knew that private interests could capture policy. A Smith useful only to one side of every modern argument is usually a Smith reduced for convenience. Amartya Sen, among later interpreters, helped restore the moral philosopher to the economist. Sen argued that Smith had been badly narrowed by readers who treated self-interest as his only principle of human action. In Smith's writings, people care about sympathy, justice, reputation, fairness, duty, and the desire to be worthy of approval. Markets operate among human beings formed by moral sentiments, not among isolated machines of appetite. This recovery did not make Smith less important to economics. It made him more difficult and therefore more alive. The phrase, "the father of capitalism," remains one of the most common labels attached to him, but it conceals almost as much as it reveals. Smith did not use capitalism as a modern ideological word. He wrote before the full factory age, before railways, before multinational corporations, before mass consumer advertising, before central banks in their modern form, before digital markets, before the global financial systems that now move capital in fractions of a second. He analyzed commercial society as he knew it, with extraordinary depth. Later, capitalism grew partly through processes he described, but it also became something larger, harsher, and more intricate than his own world. Still, the label survives because Smith asked foundational questions. What makes nations wealthy? How does labor become productive? Why does specialization matter? How do prices guide activity? What happens when trade is restricted? Why do merchants seek privilege? What should government do? How should taxes be designed? When does private interest serve public prosperity, and when does it injure it? These questions did not expire with the 18th century. They became more urgent as markets grew larger and more powerful. Modern markets still carry Smith's unresolved tensions. A company may praise competition while seeking dominance. A government may promise public protection while serving organized interests. A consumer may enjoy cheap goods without seeing the labor conditions behind them. The nation may celebrate growth while many workers remain insecure. A policy may be defended as freedom by those who benefit from rules already written in their favor. These are not alien to Smith's thought. They belong to the same family of problems he studied in the age of chartered companies: tariffs, colonial preference, and public debt. His suspicion of merchants deserves special remembrance because it is so often lost. Smith did not distrust merchants because commerce was shameful. He distrusted them in politics because their interest was concentrated, organized, and frequently opposed to that of the public. He understood that people in business possess knowledge legislators may need, but he also understood that knowledge offered by interested parties arrives mixed with desire. A modern world of lobbyists, trade associations, regulatory capture, and corporate influence has not outgrown that warning. It has multiplied its settings. At the same time, Smith's defense of open exchange should not be dissolved into suspicion alone. He saw that commerce could soften dependence, widen cooperation, encourage industry, lower prices, and improve ordinary material life. The poor in a commercial country might enjoy goods unavailable to chiefs in less developed societies. That claim carried the optimism of improvement, and it should not be denied. Smith knew that markets could liberate as well as corrupt, provide as well as distort. His strength lay in seeing both possibilities, without turning either into a total explanation. His moral philosophy also retains its pressure. Modern economic life constantly trains people to admire visible success. Wealth becomes evidence of wisdom. High status becomes evidence of merit. The rich appear happier than they are, and the poor become easier to ignore than justice allows. Smith saw this danger before modern advertising, celebrity finance, luxury branding, and social media made admiration of success into a continuous public atmosphere. His account of moral misjudgment may be one of the most modern parts of him. The impartial spectator still asks an uncomfortable question of market society. How does a person look at his own conduct when profit, ambition, and admiration are pulling him towards self-excuse? How does a business person judge the difference between fair gain and exploitation? How does a legislator distinguish public interest from the voices of those with access? How does a consumer think about comfort purchased through distance from the people who produce it? Smith did not provide simple answers to all these questions, but he gave a moral grammar for asking them. Public memory has made him visible in stone and print. Statues, university courses, think tank names, Banknotes, biographies, and quotations keep him present in forms that would likely have embarrassed the living man. A statue on Edinburgh's Royal Mile gives him a public body fixed in bronze, where visitors pass with cameras and guides repeat the familiar phrases. Such monuments are useful, but they are also misleading in the way monuments often are. They make still what was once restless, contested, revising, and unfinished. The printed page may be a truer monument. Smith was a careful maker of books. He revised, withheld, destroyed, adjusted, and guarded his own standards. The pages that survived did so because he allowed them to stand, though even they were not final in the sense that later systems wanted them to be. They remain full of movement, moral feeling passing into judgment, labor passing into wealth, self-interest passing into unintended order, private power passing into public danger, law passing into economic life. His afterlife belongs partly to misreading, but misreading is not the whole story. Great writers survive because they can be used, but they endure because they resist being used completely. Smith has been claimed by free traders, liberals, conservatives, libertarians, social democrats, historians, economists, moral philosophers, and critics of capitalism. Each group finds something real. Each risks making the found parts stand for the whole. The whole remains harder. A Scottish moral philosopher who believed commercial society could improve life, yet never stopped watching the vanity, privilege, and institutional distortion that came with it. By the time modern markets speak his name, almost everything around the name has changed. Goods cross oceans in steel containers. Prices flicker across screens. Credit expands through instruments no 18th-century banker could have imagined. Corporations outlive their founders and operate across jurisdictions. Governments tax, borrow, regulate, rescue, subsidize, and negotiate under conditions of immense complexity. Yet the basic Smithian question remains plain enough to survive all this machinery: whether the arrangements that create wealth also serve the society whose labor, trust, law, and patience make wealth possible. That is why Adam Smith still haunts every market on earth. Not as a ghost, not as a slogan, and not as the invisible hand floating free from its books. He remains because the questions he asked were placed deep inside commercial life itself. Every age that argues over trade, wages, monopoly, taxation, debt, corporate power, public works, education, and the moral limits of self-interest finds him already waiting there. Sometimes he is quoted badly, sometimes he is read carefully, sometimes he is invoked by people he would have corrected with a mild sentence and a long explanation. The man himself ended in Edinburgh, under stone, after a life of teaching, travel, writing, office, friendship, and revision. Around him, the 18th century continued to recede. Behind him remained Kirkcaldy's coast, Glasgow's classrooms, Oxford's libraries, French conversations, the long labour beside his mother, the printed book of 1776, the customs papers of his final office, and the manuscripts he chose not to leave. Ahead of him came industries, empires, reforms, revolutions, theories, departments of economics, political slogans, and markets too vast for any one mind to hold. In the end, perhaps the most faithful way to leave Smith is not with the phrase that made him famous, but with the habit that made him worth reading. He looked at familiar things until they became strange enough to understand: a pin, a price, a wage, a tax, a merchant's petition, a poor man's bread, a rich man's vanity, a government's debt, a nation's wealth. He asked what lay behind them, who benefited from them, what rules sustained them, and what moral imagination failed to see. The old pages remain. They sit in libraries, in reprints, in marked editions, in university rooms, in the hands of readers who arrive with one Smith and often leave with another. Paper yellows, bindings loosen, margins collect notes, and the arguments continue to pass from one generation to the next. Outside the page, markets open and close, ships unload, screens change, workers begin again, and somewhere in the ordinary movement of exchange, the careful questions of a Scottish philosopher keep their patient place. The journey is complete. Rest well.